Let's get ready. Down. Testing. 1, 2, 3. I think that's good. Probably the audio's good and working. So we're going to continue. Let's present, share screen. Where we left off with Bastiat's the law. How do we do this? Just like that. Okay. There we go. It's a little better. Not really. That'll work. So we'll give it a second. We'll send out the tweet or whatever. And so just to remind where we left off here, let's say do that. Okay, that's probably good. All right, so remind us where we left off. We watched the movie The King, Henry IV, adapted by Kenneth Branagh, late 2 nights ago, and we discussed the nature of the deep state. In that, someone sent me a message here on the audio and how that's working. And then we said, well, why don't we read Bastiat's The Law? It triggered off of some of the really good analysis of Scott Adams' yesterday's show on the systemic problems that we're facing. Then last night, so we did that yesterday morning, and then last night we read Lycurgus and Plutarch, the lawgiver to the Spartans. And the reason for that is that tonight we're going to read Aegis, and see what happens when a philosophically constituted nation inevitably corruption seeps in, and then that crack grows and grows for reasons that we're going to read about that are analyzed here in Bastiat. Um, we're going to see that historically there's a precedent for those nations to be able to reset and to last for centuries. Um, once everybody just says, look, as a group, we all know we're doing this well than we otherwise would be doing had we just stuck to the original wise principles of our founding. And so we'll be reading about that tonight after we continue with Bastiat's diagnosis of the situation in America. So give us a moment and we'll get started. What we could do is one moment. Okay, the first two videos I talked about are not on YouTube. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you need to go to X in order to see those two. I might take some time to find out how to upload them to YouTube, but they're not there right now. And we'll continue our reading. All right. You would oppose law to socialism, but it is the law that socialism invokes. We're there's a systemic structural reason why we're aiming in this direction, and we need to fix that. It aspires to legal, not extra legal plunder. It is of the law itself, like monopolists of all kinds, that it wants to make an instrument. And when once it has the law on its side, how will you be able to turn the law against it? How will you place it under the power of your thumb of your tribunals, your gendarmes, and of your prisons? What will you do then? You wish to prevent it from taking any part in the making of laws. You would keep it outside the legislative palace? In this you will not succeed. I venture to prophesy, so long as legal plunder is the basis of the legislation within. Now, we remember Scott Adams was saying, look, the system we have requires that certain people be in charge of making budgetary adjudications and allotments and contracts. And there's just no way with the system that we have to stop the corruption that exists. And then he gave this pitch. Well, what if we had a different group of people who did budgetary things? It's like, well, the power of the purse is in Congress. And the corruption's just gonna move to those other people and who knows? But at least it's getting you thinking about the right problem, which is what a bad first pitch is for, is to say, "Look, we're all not looking at the problem. We need to turn around and look at it. So let me give you a bad solution so that you can at least start talking about the problem as it exists." And the problem is that politicians don't provide statesmen, like the ones we read about, great statesmen do provide something of value in the form of wisdom, perhaps. But politicians in general don't provide a good or a service that anybody has. Their only commodity to sell is to betray you and your trust. They win popularity contests because large numbers of people believe important things about them for no good reason. And they are rightly anxious and insecure about that. So what do? Well, you say to yourself, if I betray the trust, if I take the power of the purse and I take a little bit of money from everybody that's been taken in taxes and I benefit this group of people, they'll be very enthusiastic about coming out and voting for me again. Right? This is the systemic problem. It's not one individual. It's not a conspiracy of people. It's the way the system is designed. It's inevitable that this happens. And once it happens, as Bastiat in 1850 is telling us, it's going to happen with every single group until we eventually get to the state that he described of everyone plundering everyone. How do you abstain from this and say, well, I'm not going to participate in it when everybody else is then plundering you alone? It forces us all into it, but it's necessarily less value for the world than if we hadn't corrupted the original philosophical principles upon which we were founded. And Bastiat is saying this is the best system you've ever had, and it's going to degrade in exactly this way, as described last night with Scott Adams's same systemic analysis of what the problem is. So last night we read about the philosophical founding of the Constitution of Sparta, and what we're going to see is that when nations are founded in that way, tonight we're going to read Aegis and see that the corruption can seep in and a crack can form and the it can be wedged wider and wider for these ratcheting systems that never go back but always have to move in that same direction. That can happen, but it's also possible with those nations, and there's a historical precedent that we're going to read about, that when a nation is founded that way, it's possible for one successful person in that nation to look around and say, we're all doing worse than we otherwise would be, right? Like, this is nonsense. Y'all want to just go back to the way it was before, and everybody just agrees and they just go back. It's something that's happened before. So we're going to read about that tonight. But right now, let's continue to look at Bastiat's analysis of what the problem is. It is absolutely necessary that this question of legal plunder should be determined, and there are only three solutions to it. When the few plunder the many, when everybody plunders everybody else, or when nobody plunders anybody. Partial plunder, universal plunder, or the absence of plunder. Amongst these, we have to make our choice. The law can only produce one of these results. I'd say the American system that we have now has degraded to a point where it's the few plundering the many, but the few that are doing the plundering keeps changing, right? So everybody's interested, as he pointed out. You've got to be so madly interested in politics, and CEOs that could be making better numbers for their investors. They're spending billions of dollars lobbying Congress for laws that are slightly written to benefit Coke against Pepsi because this is the water you can use and blah 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 for making soft drinks. They just have a law about everything, and so what happens is, you've got to care because then you can change who's doing the plundering, right? But this is the opposite of the success of the wisdom of the structure that we were originally constituted with. It's the degradation of that into nothing. But what we could have is close to what we originally had, or what we were close to originally having. I meant to say. Partial plunder, this is the law can only produce one of these results. Partial plunder. This is a system that prevails so long as the elective privilege was partial, a system that was resorted to avoid the invasion of socialism. You can have universal plunder. And he points out this is why suddenly everybody cared about universal suffrage, because hey, if you're using this hammer of state to steal from other people to get an unfair advantage instead of just competing fairly or whatever, okay, well then everybody's got to have a right to be involved in that. But nobody had to care that much before this corruption. Universal plunder. We have been threatened by this system. Yeah, it's coming. When the electoral privilege, I mean, it's largely here. The electoral privilege has become universal. The masses have conceived the idea of making law on the principle of legislators who had preceded them. Or you could have the absence of plunder. This is the principle of justice, peace, order, stability. conciliation, and of good sense, which I shall proclaim with all the force of my lungs, which is very inadequate, alas, till the day of my death. And in all sincerity, can anything be required at the hands of the law? Can the law, whose necessary sanction is force, be reasonably oh, I should be doing this there, sorry. Be reasonably employed upon anything beyond securing to everyone his right? I defy anyone to remove it from this circle without perverting it, and consequently turning force against right. And as this is the most fatal, the most illogical social perversion that can possibly be imagined, it must be admitted that the true solution, so much sought after, of the social problem is contained in these simple words: law is organized justice. Now, it is impossible to remark that to organize justice by law, that is to say, by force, excludes the idea of organizing by law or by force any manifestation whatever of human activity: labor, charity, agriculture, commerce, industry, instruction, the fine arts, or religion. For any one of these organizings would inevitably destroy the essential organization. How, in fact, can we imagine force encroaching upon the liberty of citizens without infringing upon justice, and so acting against its proper aim? We got into this a lot yesterday, and I love his lists here. But um, go back and watch what we said about the separation of church and state being invented by Christians because they did not want the state to destroy their religion, and how if academics had that level of testicular fortitude, they might not have destroyed the universities. And if doctors could stand up against it, we wouldn't have a takeover from the government and what's inevitably going to be happening. Well, people don't even trust any experts at all anymore, and there's good reason for it. They've lost their credibility. Here I am. You have to think of yourself as independent. What right does some shallow, hollow, glib asshole who wins an election have to tell you about how to run the industry that you're running? Or, I mean, how many decades does it take to be expert enough to do that well in competition with others who are cutthroat, right? What right does that same glib jerk have to tell you about what research would be good to fund? Well, they're doing all of this, and it's all worthless, and everybody can see through it now. But then we're left with nothing. But we could go back to great, unbelievably untapped value that we've lost just by choosing to. And what's interesting about this text is that it shows that there's nobody with an interest in staying in the corrupted and continually corrupted system that we have. Not even the deep state power shadow creatures who fancy themselves to be smarter than other people just because their computer told them more facts about the other person and they don't know their name while they're being anonymous. Those people themselves would have more power if they were ruling over injustice, but if they were ruling even with limitations over a much more powerful nation than one that they drive into beggary and bankruptcy, even if they have 100% of that power. So there's no group you need to fight against except yourself. Every single person is pushing in this direction, and we could all just say, let's go back. And we're going to read Aegis, a historical time when that happened, for centuries of thriving. All right, let's see. Here I am taking on the most popular prejudice of our time. It is not considered enough that law should be just. It must be philanthropic. It is not sufficient that it should guarantee to every citizen the free and inoffensive exercise of his faculties applied to his physical, intellectual, and moral development. It is required to extend well being, instruction, and morality directly over the nation. This is the fascinating side of socialism. Okay, so the left was pretty happy with what happened before in this essay. Now the point that the right has to make is going to be made here because the real problem is bigger than what the left or the right, while pointing fingers at each other, thinks it is. But I repeat, these two missions of the law contradict each other. We have to choose between them. A citizen cannot at the same time be free and not free. Mr. Delamartine wrote to me one day thus: "Your doctrine is only the half of my program. You have stopped at liberty. I go on to fraternity." I answered him, "The second part of your program will destroy the first. And in fact, it is impossible for me to separate the word fraternity from the word voluntary. I cannot possibly conceive fraternity legally enforced without liberty being legally destroyed and justice legally trampled underfoot. Legal plunder has two roots. One of them, as we have already seen, is in human greed. The other is in misconceived philanthropy. Before I proceed, I think I ought to explain myself upon the word plunder. I do not take it, as it is so often taken, in a vague, undefined, relative, or metaphorical sense. I use it in its scientific acceptation and as expressing the opposite idea to property. When a portion of wealth passes out of the hands of him who has acquired it without his consent and without compensation to him who has not created it, whether by force or by artifice, I say that property is violated, that plunder is perpetrated. I say that this is exactly what the law ought to repress always and everywhere. If the law itself performs the action it ought to repress, I say that plunder is still perpetrated, and even in a social point of view, under aggravated circumstances. In this case, however, he who profits from the plunder is not responsible for it. It is the law, the lawgiver, society itself, and this is where the political danger lies. It is to be regretted that there is something offensive in the world, in the word. I have sought in vain. There's a Freudian slip for you. Something offensive in the word. I have sought in vain for another, for I would not wish at any time, and especially just now, to add an irritating word to our disagreements. Therefore, whether I am believed or not, I declare that I do not mean to impugn the intentions nor the morality of anybody. I am attacking an idea that I believe to be false, a system that appears to me to be unjust, and this is so independent of intentions that each of us profits by it without wishing it and suffers from it without being aware of the cause. This is his whole point. The left would have appreciated parts of the previous part of the essay. The right's going to say, hey, you're making our point now. Both sides are pointing fingers, and neither one is understanding the big problem. The big problem is none of us want this. And yet, every single individual has the incentive, now that the corruption has seeped in the system, to push in exactly the same direction until we end up with the plunder of all by all, which is so inefficient and so worthless. And the world becomes so much poorer because of it. And we would all choose to go back if only we could trust that everybody would choose simultaneously to go back. And we're going to read tonight about a reset that happened historically like that. Okay, any person must write under the influence of party spirit or of fear who would call into question the sincerity of protectionism, of socialism, and even of communism, which are one and the same plant in three different periods of its growth. All that can be said is that plunder is more visible by its partiality in protectionism and by its universality in communism. Whence it follows that of the three systems, socialism is still the most vague, the most undefined, and consequently the most sincere. It's coming like Christmas. The whole system's pushing towards it, and we can understand why and how, and just choose on a dime to turn it all around. It's not a group of socialists imposing it upon you. Be that as it may, to conclude that legal plunder has one of its roots in misconceived philanthropy is evidently to put intentions out of the question. With this understanding, let us examine the value, the origin, and the tendency of this popular aspiration, which pretends to realize the general good by general plunder. The socialists say, since the law organizes justice, why should it not organize labor, instruction, and religion? We talked about this in yesterday's video when we read the first half. The founding of this country was made by Christian men who invented secularism. Do not destroy my church by giving me money. I'm not gonna get in bed with something as large as the state. It's gonna fuck my religion. I'm sure of it. In all the subtle ways that it inevitably must. Well, we liked when this guy was preaching, but we don't like what this one's saying, and we're deciding on the budget this year. I mean, just protect your church from the state. Protect your academic institutions from the state. Demand a wall of separation. Protect your medical professionals and your hospitals from the state. Protect all of the peer reviewed journal articles, all of that bullshit that's been infiltrated so badly that it's producing nothing of worth anymore when these were the well springs of the greatest value on the planet until they were corrupted. Understand the proper role of the state and, like Apollo, pull back upon the reins. The socialists say since the law organizes justice, why should it not be involved in these other things? Why? Because it could not organize labor, instruction, and religion without disorganizing justice. For remember that law is force, and that consequently the domain of the law cannot properly extend beyond the domain of force. When law and force keep a man within the bounds of justice, they impose nothing upon him but a mere negation. It's all about restraint. Benjamin Franklin, if men were angels, they would need not governments. If governments were run by angels, we would need not constitutions. They only oblige him to abstain from doing harm. They violate neither his personality, his liberty, nor his property. They only guard the personality, the liberty, and the property of others. They hold themselves on the defensive. They defend the equal right of all. They fulfill a mission whose harmlessness is evident, whose utility is palpable, and whose legitimacy is not to be disputed. A jab at the anarchists. This is so true that, as a friend of mine once remarked to me, to say that the aim of the law is to cause justice to reign is to use an expression that is not rigorously exact. It ought to be said, the aim of the law is to prevent injustice from reigning. You see the negation of the definition in our video on Apollo and Daphne. This is the ancient mythological lesson that was understood by all, that was understood by every successful nation and encoded in mythological, characterological terms thousands of years ago. You are the descendants of the ancestors who understood this in deep poetic form. And if they hadn't, you wouldn't be here. In fact, it is not justice that has an existence of its own, it is injustice. The one results from the absence of the other. But when the law, that's an interesting, we won't get into sidetracks. That's an interesting inversion of, I think, an Aquinas Christian notion that evil is not real. It's just the absence of good. What he's saying here is that from the government force perspective, what you have to see is that injustice is the only thing to exist, and you must eliminate it, and then don't go about trying to create justice beyond that. Uh, that was worse said than the way he said it, so we'll skip. That's an interesting way that he's forming it here. All right, but when the law, through the medium of its necessary agent force, imposes a form of labor, a method of a method or a subject of instruction, a creed or a worship. I remember Alan Bloom writing his book. What do you expect if a government runs an education program? Inevitably, it will produce subjects easy to rule for its regime. In North Korea, you're going to get an education system that makes you worship the dear leader. And in America, you're going to get an education system that produces people highly susceptible to simplistic narratives from the multi-billion-dollar propaganda machine called the entirety of the media. It can't be otherwise. There, it's too big a force to have its interests not take over and destroy the other things. Get out of bed with it. But when the law and we said this yesterday, but you see this wisdom does exist in certain private schools and often they're religious private schools in this country who have refused on principle to ever take money from the government. The government says, "Hey, no, you're all doing generally good things. Let's just give you some funds." No, we don't want your fucking money. Get out of here. And those are, of course, the only schools that teach the kids how to read. So all of this is, one of the things that is annoying about intellectuals is that they have all their theories and their ideas and they can debate things forever, and it's kind of right that people should sort of hand wave that away to some degree because it's annoying. But one of the things that we could do while we're actually diving into these primary texts that help to explain who we are and what the hell's going on is we could say, why don't we just do a pragmatic comparative politics analysis? Why don't we just say, all right, you've got all your theories about why this would work and not that. And you've got the opposite theories about why this should work and not that. And you can twist your statistics to claim it is working, both of you all the time. Why don't we just actually look at what's working and say, well, even if your theory's wrong, in practice, it's working. And that would be enough. That would honestly be enough for us to move in the right direction here. All right, but when the law, through the medium of its necessary agent force, impose a form of labor, a method or a subject of instruction, a creed or a worship, it is no longer negative. It acts positively upon men. It substitutes the will of the legislator for their own will, the initiative of the legislator for their own initiative. They have no need to consult, to compare, or to foresee. The law does all that for them. God, how look, things aren't working anymore. They're especially never working in bureaucratic. You go to the DMV and see how well things work. But There's some psychological insights here that are worth noticing. I remember there was some show about vampires. It was a comedy show, like a mockumentary. It was called, What We Do in the Shadows, and the American version. And, there's this one scene where the vampire's trying to get his, US citizenship, and he goes in to hypnotize the person administering the test, and he comes out frustrated that it's not working, and he goes, "These bureaucratic, employees, they seem unsusceptible to hypnotism. It's like their souls are already dead." Anyway, um, it's so annoying to talk to people who have just no life within them. I wanna wear a button at university. I used to wanna put a button, it just says, "Get a life." It's just say something surprising. Don't tell me what Stephen Colbert said last night, and I can predict you're gonna say it before his show even comes on. I know what he's gonna say, and then you're gonna repeat it the next day. You've had your will and your agency and your initiative and your ability to think replaced by the state. This is how this happens. The intellect is for them a useless encumbrance. They cease to be men. They lose their personality, their liberty, their property. You're goddamn right. In 1850, he wrote this about our nation, saying, "Here's the crack, and here's how it's gonna move in this direction," in a ratcheting way where you can't go back unless you decide to just reset. Try to imagine a form of labor imposed by force that is not a violation of liberty, a transmission of wealth imposed by force that is not a violation of property. If you can not succeed in reconciling this, you are bound to conclude that the law cannot organize labor and industry without organizing injustice. When, from the seclusion of his office, a politician takes a view of society, he is struck with the spectacle of inequality that presents itself. He mourns over the sufferings that are the lot of so many of our brethren, sufferings whose aspect is rendered yet more sorrowful by the contrast of luxury and wealth. Good. He ought perhaps to ask himself whether such a social state has not been caused by the plunder of ancient times, exercised in the way of conquests, and by plunder of more recent times, effected through the medium of the laws. He ought to ask himself whether, granting the aspiration of all men to well being and improvement, the reign of justice would not suffice to realize the greatest activity of progress and the greatest amount of equality compatible with that individual responsibility that God has awarded as a just retribution of virtue and vice. We read last night Lycurgus in Plutarch. Very radical, very philosophical. I mean, they invented a word for sort of more than an edict, grand sweeping laws that seem more like religious, spiritual edicts than simply changes of a legislative nature alone. If you aspire to fame in statescraft because you say, "Well, I can lie to a group of suffering people and make them more slaves than they were before and make them more miserable and dependent than they were before, but at least they'll think I care about them and I'm doing them some good." There's something much better you could do with your life before you died. We read about it last night, and we're gonna read about Aegis tonight. He never gives this a thought. His mind turns towards combinations, arrangements, legal or factitious organizations. He seeks the remedy in perpetrating and exaggerating what has produced the evil. For justice apart, which we have seen is only a negation, from the state perspective, I would say, at least. Anyway, is there any one of these legal arrangements that does not contain the principle of plunder? You say, there are men who have no money. Then you apply to the law. But the law is not a self supplied fountain, whence every stream may obtain supplies independently of society. Nothing can enter the public treasury in favor of one citizen or one class, but what other citizens and other classes have been forced to send to it. If everyone draws from it only the equivalent of what it has contributed, your law to it is true is no plunderer, but it does nothing for the men who want money. It does not promote equality. It can only be an instrument of equalization as far as it takes from one party and gives to another. And then it is an instrument of plunder. Examine, So the left had lots to celebrate about the beginning part of this essay. They're gonna have a lot of problems with this part. Remember, it's always the third unseen person that you need to remember. So let's sneak in a little bit of some Austrian economics school stuff here because they have a germ of a point on this alone, right? We had said there were some better theories about why gold has value and things like that, perhaps. But let's bring in this principle here. You say, well, if I throw a rock through a window, it'll break the window, and the shop owner will have to buy a new window. And that means that the guy who replaces windows, whose business wasn't doing well, will be benefited. So maybe what we should do is just have some destruction, pay some street urchins to throw some rocks through windows periodically so that we can keep the economy running. And that's exactly the same argument for, hey, the war would be good economically because then we can blow up all our factories, but then we can rebuild them as better factories, right? And you say, okay, well, I guess that could be economically valuable, but it never is. And the reason why it never is the third party that you're not considering. The guy who owns the shop who has to pay for the new window had the money. He was going to buy his wife a fur coat, or he was going to invest in new um, mixers for the dough or whatever it is that he's doing in his shop, and he doesn't get to spend the money on that anymore. So the world is it has reallocated money from one person to another person instead of to where it was going to go. But the main point is the entire world is poorer by one window. The people who own factories set aside money in order to upgrade their instruments and upgrade their machinery. They choose when it's best to do that. They have all of the knowledge and incentive to do it as quickly as when it is correct to do it. You coming in and making it happen is necessarily a less good economic situation. You say, well, I own some land and I want to buy a tractor so that I can farm that land. And wouldn't that be a good thing? Let me have a government program that would let me apply and say, give me the money for a tractor because I can't afford it. He said, well, that sounds good. Let's have that program. There already is an institution that does that. It's called the bank. And if I can't get the money for a tractor from the bank, it means that I don't have any credit. The people with all the incentive in the world to say, hey, we don't want to be giving money where we're not going to get it paid back. We've done all the research they need to do to say, not that guy. We're not giving him the money for the tractor. It's not coming back, and the world's not going to have the benefits of that tractor anymore. He's not gonna use it properly. The only person you can give money to in a government program like that is the person where no one would choose willingly to do it themselves. That's one of the main points Bastiat is making is if you need the state to do this thing, it's because nobody would choose to do it. It's necessarily going to be bad for everybody. It'll temporarily benefit one small group at the expense of everybody else to a small degree, but the entire ship will sink a little bit. The entire tide will go down by that pane of glass or that whatever it is, that factory, that it's all going to be down just that much. And once one group of special interests say, hey, you've got to care about our industry and protect us, so subsidize us not to grow anything or whatever, and have a new budget every single year and pass that bill again. What you're doing is you're saying we're postponing the time that an industrious person who was successful in this industry before it wasn't needed anymore could have gone into something else and produced other things of value in the world. The world is poorer by that much grain that we're paying you not to grow, and it's poorer by that much other things that you could have chosen to do. Instead, you're just stifled there in a place where the entire world says that's not a good place to put money, and we're forcing it to go there instead. It's by definition never good for the overall. It's only benefiting one small group, which become enthusiastic voters to reelect you to make sure that you stay in it. But eventually, every other group in competition also starts spending millions of dollars lobbying so that they can compete, and then it's the plunder of all by all, and everything is just reduced to nothing. And you have a totalitarian 100% powerful state over absolutely a steaming pile of garbage. So there's no real power even for those who seek power to rule over. The whole thing, no one in the system wants it, but everyone in the system has the incentive to keep pushing in that direction so long as others are also. We started it not this way. In the 1850s, this French philosopher is analyzing the American system and saying, well, I see what's going to happen. It's perfect. It's brilliant. It's the best we've ever had. Here's the crack, and here's how it's going to widen. The only solution is a reset where we all at the same time, instead of the left saying it's the right, the left saying, oh, it's those evil, greedy corporate capitalists that are doing all of this. Yeah, of course they are. That's the system you've got. You've got an evil group of greedy poor people who are lazy and also want government handouts. And then you say, oh, well, it's a government handout for the corporation. Yeah, everyone's playing this game and no one's benefiting from it. No one's benefiting from it. Some crafty people with a lot of money are benefiting slightly better this month, and then the election will go the other way, and some other group will slightly benefit at everybody's expense, but everybody's poorer than they otherwise would be, and this is the systemic problem Scott Adams, I think, was pointing out in his show yesterday, which is how we got into reading this. Okay, examine in this light the protection of tariffs, subsidies, right right to profit, right to labor, right to assistance, free public education, progressive taxation, gratuitousness of credit, social workshops, and you will always find at the bottom legal plunder, organized injustice. You say there are men who want knowledge, and you apply to the law. But the law is not a torch. I mean, look, we watched this happen. I prophesied to multiple universities that have been around for 150 years. You won't be here in 5 years. I said that looking in the eyes of the administrators. I said, "You won't be here in 5 years. I'm not opposing you. You won't be here in 5 years." Everybody sees that you've devalued the piece of paper that you sell to people. You've increased what it costs so that they can be in debt for the rest of their life for a worthless piece of paper so that everybody can get it. Oh, but men want knowledge. We need more people to get a college education. Only if they deserve it, only if they desire it, only if they are capable of it. Actually, a very small portion of people should be wasting their time doing something like that. They can provide a lot of value to others if they do it and they work real hard at it, but only a small proportion. When you say everyone has to do it, you say, well, it has to be worth nothing so that we can give it to everyone. Obviously, those institutions don't exist anymore. They're shutting down. One of them shut down 9 departments. They got rid of all their languages except Spanish. They talked about becoming a performance art school. They gave up on that idea. They talked about becoming a trade school, but the trade schools already exist. They shut down the geology department, the philosophy department. They shut down the physics department, the chemistry. They shut down their computer science department, which was actually well above average for other schools. It was an envy. They've shut everything down within the 5 years of me saying this isn't going to last. You've destroyed the reason you exist. Why? The federal government said we can funnel a bunch of money into you. The administrator said, hey, we'll be millionaires and we'll create a whole bunch of Orwellian job titles for a bunch of people to have Kafka-esque show trials of whether or not this student brought up a subject that upset this student and to tell the professors what words to use. That's the opposite of a university. As I said to one professor, 18-year-olds don't come to university to tell tenured professors what fucking words to use. But the head of the philosophy department told that professor, these are kids, they mean well, and you should be careful about the words you use. By the way, he said an idea was idiotic. Oh, you're like a Nazi who wants to lock up all the retarded people. Oh, you said retarded when talking about it's like it's all none of that is about language. None of that is about approaching truth. It's all the exact opposite of the reason why people with an instinct to say, I want to live a serious academic life, come to get to meet people who can embody the patterns of that way of being to say, hey, show me what good books to read and have their views exposed to the criticisms of other students who've come for the same reason and to have those conversations. All of that has been completely shut down so that everyone can get a college education. There is no education in that anymore. It's exactly as prophesied by Bastiat in 1850. You say there are men who want knowledge and you apply to the law. But the law is not a torch that sheds light that originates within itself. It extends over a society where there are men who have knowledge and others who have it not, citizens who want to learn and others who are disposed to teach. It can only be one of two things. Either allow a free operation of this kind of transaction, i.e., let this kind of want satisfy itself freely, or else by the way, I have a solution for you universities now that one of you reported to me that you have 1/10 the students you used to have, and you're lying to the federal government in order to keep funding coming in. And the other one is the one that I just described. And the other SUNY school, these are all in the SUNY system. The other one was completely shut down. I just recently heard. I haven't even looked into this, but I'm sure it's not the only one. Here's a good solution for you. Uh, we can turn this whole thing around at any moment. All the administrators of the universities are no longer involved in education. They haven't been from the beginning anyway. Here's a bad first pitch. Rent out the space. Just rent out the space. A professor rents out a lecture hall. He gets students to pay him directly in order to have access to what he's teaching. And you meet there. You're not hiring professors, you're not firing them, you're not having anything to say about what their schedule is anymore. Your job is to rent out the space that exists, and probably there's better spaces, including possibly online spaces like we're doing now, but that's maybe your best bet. It can only do one of 2 things, either allow the free operation of this kind of transaction, i.e., it can let this kind of want satisfy itself freely, or else preempt the will of the people in the matter and take from some of them sufficient to pay professors commission to instruct others for free. But in the second case, there cannot fail to be a violation of liberty and property, legal plunder. You say, here are men who are wanting in morality or religion, and you apply to the law, but the law is force and need I say how far it is a violent and absurd enterprise to introduce force in these matters. As the result of its systems and of its efforts, it would seem that socialism, notwithstanding all its self-complacency, can scarcely help perceiving the monster of legal plunder. But what does it do? It disguises it cleverly from others and even from itself under the seductive names of fraternity, solidarity, organization, equity, association, uh, reparations, like anything. Give it whatever word you want. It's not good for anybody. It temporarily benefits some by making them slaves, but giving them some money, right? I mean, since I added reparations to the list, but this is the exact same principle of making slaves of everybody who falls for this type of thing. I'll just remind you all that slave owners, they give some things to their slaves, they give food, clothing, housing, occasional medical care, and really shit education. And if you want to sell yourself into slavery, slaves are made in such ways. We can assure them that what we repudiate is not natural organization, but forced organization. It is not free association, but the forms of association that they would impose upon us. You know what's interesting about the truth of all of this is that I feel like there's a whiff in the air, a fresh air scent that you can tell in the zeitgeist of the argument right now, where people are starting to suspect that if there wasn't an army of people maniacally preoccupied with controlling the expression, speech, opinions, and industry of people like Elon Musk, we might already be at Mars. People like him too, right? That if they weren't just preoccupied with finding those people and reducing the good that those people that there actually is the capacity for individuals to work together to make things better if they weren't being stolen from in order for, the false promise of we're going to make everything a utopia if you just give it all to us, even though we've never accomplished anything in our entire lives. You have to start looking at 2 things. Statesmen are one thing, statescraft is one thing, and politicians are another. And the vast majority of politicians are and always have been hollow, shallow, ambitious fools that offer nothing to anyone and are deeply anxious about that fact. And so can't wait to be in charge of anything that might point out to them their naked nothingness. At least McDonald's convinces you to exchange some of your purchasing power for a piece of shit hamburger. At least they have to convince you to do that. I'm not saying it's wonderful, but heck, it's a heck of a lot better than that. When those people decide that they're gonna take over and force everything to be good, it's by definition not going to be. But I'm sensing that people are starting to suspect that that's the case. So we're getting the ingredients together for the great reset of a new great reset. I know there's some people out there who think, oh, there's mustache twisting evil people out there playing this. No, it's you. Everybody's pushing in the same direction. But what we need is a great reset back to the founding fathers, back to the philosophical principles that made this so uncorrupt originally that Bastiat can see a couple of cracks and he can prophesy exactly how they'll play out, and they have played out in exactly that way to where we are today. We need to reset back, but we can. We could just decide to. It is not free association, but the forms of association that they would impose upon us. It is not spontaneous fraternity, but legal fraternity. That's a great point he made earlier. We should have dwelt on it a bit. The idea that you could force people to be brotherly to one another, compulsory love, the heart of sadomasochism. I shouldn't even say the heart, the core of sadomasochism. It's not good. It is not providential solidarity, but artificial solidarity, which is only an unjust displacement of responsibility. He's describing the next 150 years, like many of the people we read. Socialism, like the old policy from which it emanates, confounds government and society. And so every time we object to a thing being done by government, it concludes that we object to it being done at all. We disapprove of education by the state, then we're against education altogether. You just hate the children. We object to a state religion, then we would have no religion at all. What are you, a bunch of atheists? We object to an equality which is brought about by the state, then we are against equality, etc., etc., etc. No, the germ of truth. So again, we saw the germ of truth from the left in the first half of this article. Now the germ of truth from the right needs to be hammered into the brains of the self-righteous and smug leftists. You're not the only people who care about these things. The other side is opposed to you, and neither side is the source of the problem. Everybody's the source of the problem, as he's illustrating the larger problem here. But the other side is opposed to your solution. Again, both are pushing in the wrong way, but you're pushing in the wrong way in this way because you are damaging to equality, because you are damaging to the well-being of people, because you are damaging education in ways that were predictable from those who had the insights from the right, which all panned out to be correct. So it's time we all take a deep breath, both sides, and say, okay, wait a minute. Bastia is saying you're both right when you point to the evils of the other side. You're both right. So you're both doing the same evil thing in the opposite side, in opposition to each other, feeding off each other. But it wasn't always this way. You could reset. You could go back to when nobody was getting an unfair advantage from the state. You have no idea how much wealth you would have. Look, even with all the bad policies in the inner cities, 80 years, Democrats have been running and destroying the lives of people who live in those places. Even with all of that unchanged, if all you did was not tax any of those people, I know from experience there are plenty who want to set up good little businesses that would have made things better. It's utter bankruptcy, beggary, and poverty for one reason and one reason only. And you need to get this through your head. It doesn't matter how good your intentions are or how good you'd like other people to think they are. I've said this in other classes. I'm going to say it right now. The distance between heaven and hell is the distance between caring about something and caring that people think of you as the one who cares about that thing. That is the distance between heaven and hell. And they're right next to each other, and you're missing it. How is it that the strange idea of making the law produce what it does not contain? It's just really brilliant. We'll have to take another look at Apollo and all of that again. But once again, it's understanding the nature of what government is to know what it's good for and what it should be used for. He's kind of got this down in a way that we're skipping over too lightly. How can you expect the state to produce what it does not contain? Prosperity in a positive sense, wealth. Its wealth comes from taxing people who work and produce so much value to others that those others willingly exchange some of their purchasing power for them. And then the government even takes some of that and they're still living. The government's not producing the wealth. Science, religion, these are different entities. Now, the Christians who founded the United States understood this. They're the only ones who said, we want a wall of separation between your fucking government and our churches. You're not going to poison it. You're not going to demand that we get tithes from everybody. We have a way of living that is worshiping the divine properly, and we're going to show the example of our lives. But if the people sitting in the pews are forced to be there, how does anybody know if what we're saying means anything? Don't you poison our church. We actually have something good to offer. Why won't the scientists do the same? Was the funding worth it? Destroying anybody's respect for you? Nobody cares. Oh, the great experts coming on CNN. Nobody gives a shit. Was it worth it? You destroyed every reason why people rightfully respected you. And nobody listens anymore. And the world is poorer because no one knows who they can go to get any truth about their health or about what's true about the world. Are you glad that you did this? You got lots of funding. You destroyed every decent scientist. You destroyed their careers, and nobody trusts anybody anymore. For obvious reasons that could be understood and were understood by the religious when they set up that wall of separation. I'm not even gonna start on the teachers unions. For God's sake, they're completely gone. Anybody who, well, not anybody, I know some, but the modern politicians, particularly those of the socialist school, founded their different theories upon one common hypothesis. And surely a more strange, a more presumptuous notion could never have entered a human brain. They divide mankind into two parts. Men in general, except one, form the first. The politician himself forms the second, which is by far the most important. In fact, they begin by supposing that men are devoid of any principle of action and of any means of discernment in themselves. It's funny that we read Lycurgus last night, who, if you were listening, it was kind of, so for those of you on the left who just can't handle the heat right now, we're gonna have to get through this, and we're gonna have to face it, and you really need to come along with us. But for those of you who just can't handle it, remember what we read about Lycurgus last night, and whenever a right-wing person goes on your campus and says, "How come communism has always failed?" Now you know the counterexample from history. Actually, it hasn't. You can have a totalitarian system that strives quite well and has, actually, I shouldn't call it a totalitarian system. You can have a radical communist revolution that lasts 500 years and then resets itself after the corruption comes in. I'm not advocating that, by the way. I'm not defending the left here. What I'm saying is, what Bastiat is saying is that it's bigger than that. You're both wrong and you're both pushing in the wrong direction. In fact, they begin by supposing that I mean, he's basically describing the situation in a sense. But anyway, well, Lycurgus set things up in a way that counteracted these evils, it seems. Remember, the great politicians ate at the same table as everybody else, and nobody had any, whatever. So we won't change the subject. Let's keep reading. In fact, they begin by supposing the men are devoid of the politicians. They're the important ones, right? What are you thinking of now? In the last century, the 24 times that being party loyal was the most virtuous thing you could be, and you got thrown in the gulag if your neighbor didn't like you and so reported you as not being party loyal. You laughed at the wrong joke or something. I mean, the whole world is reduced to nothing of value and everybody starves to death. It was understood thousands of years ago in the mythology. It was understood philosophically by the founders of great nations and nation states and city states, both in Greece and in the United States. And philosophical constitutions were put together to have separations of powers and solve these problems. And then the little cracks of corruption, as predictable from 1850, lead ratchet like in this direction of tearing it back into nothing. We can just choose to reset. And tonight we're going to read Aegis's Great Reset of that other civilization that was founded like that. In any event, let's continue reading. They have no initiative, that they are inert matter, passive particles, atoms without impulse, at best a vegetation indifferent from to its own mode of existence, susceptible of assuming from an exterior will and hand an infinite number of forms, more or less symmetrical, artistic, and perfected. What is he describing? He's describing you. Quid rides mutato nomine. Moreover, every one of these politicians does not, that means, why are you laughing? Change but the name, and the story's about you. Moreover, every one of these politicians does not hesitate to assume that he himself is, under the names of organizer, discoverer, legislator, institutor, or founder, this will in hand, this universal initiative, this creative power, whose sublime mission is to gather together these scattered materials, that is, men, into society. New fires will come into the world, says the story from thousands of years ago. If you forget the lesson, Apollo in every painting and sculpture is depicted with his arm with the musculature strained in trying to pull back on the reins. Government will run more the wilds will run wild of their own accord. Your art thine art should be the pulling back of the reins. This is what the founding philosophers of this nation understood, why they put these checks and balances to restrain this monstrous machine. They weren't anarchists, they knew it was necessary, but it was necessary in its conception in opposition to the evils of individual men. In other words, in opposition to human nature, the worst parts of human nature, the worst parts in you and the worst parts of others and of the society. It's in opposition to you. It is inevitable that it results in the grinding up of millions of people when you find a final solution in that. It is born in opposition to humanity. taking it as an absolute and the source of the answers, whether you're a fascist Nazi or a communist, like we did 24 times in the last century, predictably, that's the point, predictably results in the deaths of millions of people. It's that kind of machine, you fucking morons. And your ancestors, excuse me, understood that. And they prophesied to us thusly. They said, if you forget the point of the lesson of this story, new fires will come into the world. In the last century, we forgot this lesson. We had to invent the term nuclear fire. Holocaust and genocide took on new meanings. New fires came into the world, and your ancestors, who are far more brilliant than you're the retarded offspring of them. Pay attention to these texts, pay attention to these classes. They told you that's exactly what would happen, and it did. Starting from these data, as a gardener, according to his caprice, shapes his trees into pyramids, parasols, cubes, cones, vases, espaliers, distaffs, or fans. So the socialist, following his chimera, shapes poor humanity into groups, series, circles, subcircles, honeycombs, or social workshops with all kinds of variations. And as the gardener, to bring his trees into shape, needs hatchets, pruning hooks, saws, and shears, so the politician, to bring society into shape, needs the forces which he can only find in the laws, the law of tariffs, the law of taxation, the law of assistance, the law of education. It is so true that the socialists look upon mankind as a subject for social experiments that if by chance they are not quite certain of the success of these experiments, they will request a portion of mankind as a subject to experiment upon. It is well known how popular the idea of trying all systems is, and one of their chiefs has been known seriously to demand of the constituent assembly a parish with all its inhabitants upon which to make his experiments. Are we against A/B testing now? I don't know. What Bastiat is saying is run your A/B testing experiments, but run them in liberty rather than by force. It is thus that an inventor, you can look at the bubble of education that's bursting, just like the housing bubble of the 90s. I'm saying that for one audience member here. It is thus that an inventor will make a small machine before he makes one of the regular size. Thus, the chemist sacrifices some substances, the agriculturalist some seed, and a corner of his field to make trial of an idea. But think of the difference between the gardener and his trees, between the inventor and his machine, between the chemist and his substances, between the agriculturalist and his seed. The socialist thinks in all sincerity that there is the same difference between himself and mankind. No wonder the politicians of the 19th century look upon society as as an artificial production of the legislator's genius. This idea, the result of a classical education, has taken possession of all the thinkers and great writers of our country. Now, that's interesting because we did read Plutarch last night, and it was very clear that Lycurgus thought of the people as the product of his legislative work. Let's see what Bastiat has to say. Maybe we'll get a good dialectic conversation between one perspective and another here. All of civilization is about an ongoing conversation between various perspectives: Jerusalem and Athens, Athens and Sparta, Athens and Jerusalem, Philadelphia and Athens, right? Conversations between the mythopoetic and the propositional, between the religious and the philosophical, right? So let's see what Bastiat's take is on this because he's blaming classical education. Right now, it's so bad we could use some classical education, I would think, but let's see. To all these persons, the relations between mankind and the legislator appear to be the same as those that exist between clay and the potter. Moreover, if they have consented to recognize in the heart of man a capability of action and in his intellect a faculty of discernment, they have looked upon this gift of God as a fatal one and thought of that mankind under these two impulses tended fatally towards ruin. There's a war going on right now between vampires and werewolves. Most people are locked in the matrix, peacefully sleeping away and not understanding the nature of this war, becoming agents of it at will, completely controlled in their perceptions. The war exists between about 2 dozen individuals who have the following maxim which motivates them. They believe that if they're incapable of predicting what's going to happen, then anything can happen, and they require absolute power over everybody as much as possible to affect and manipulate what could possibly happen. Because if people were left to do whatever they wanted to do and they were free, who the hell knows what they might do? And that could be chaos and disaster. That's one side of this war. The other side of the war is motivated by individuals who, in their breast, harbor this ridiculous notion that if everybody was freer, if there was less injustice imposed upon them, the net result would be a great amount of good for everybody. If people were empowered and educated and equipped and not restrained and controlled, a lot of good, good that you can't imagine would happen. I know what side I'm on. Moreover, if they have consented to recognize in the heart of man ca- a capability of action and in his intellect a faculty of discernment, they have looked upon this gift of God as a fatal one and thought that mankind, under these two impulses, tended fatally towards ruin. They have taken it for granted that if abandoned to their own inclinations, men would only occupy themselves with religion to arrive at atheism, with instruction to come to ignorance, and with labor and exchange to be extinguished in misery. Happily, according to these writers, there are some men, termed governors and legislators, upon whom heaven has bestowed opposite tendencies, not for their own sake only, but for the sake of the rest of the world. Whilst mankind tends to evil, they incline to good. Whilst mankind is advancing towards darkness, they are aspiring to enlightenment. Whilst mankind is drawn towards vice, they are attracted by virtue. And this granted, they demand the assistance of force, by means of which they are to substitute their own tendencies for those of the human race. It is only needful to open, almost at random, a book on philosophy, politics, or history to see how strongly this idea, the child of classical studies and the mother of socialism, is rooted in our country, that mankind is merely inert matter receiving life, organization, morality, and wealth from power, or rather, and still worse, that mankind itself tends towards degradation and is only arrested in its tendency by the mysterious hand of the legislator. Classical conventionalism shows us everywhere behind passive society a hidden power under the names of law or legislator, or by a mode of expression which refers to some person or persons of undisputed weight and authority but not named, which moves, animates, enriches, and regenerates mankind. We will give a quotation from Bastiat. One of the things which was the most strongly impressed by whom upon the mind of the Egyptians was the love of their country. Nobody was allowed to be useless to the state. The law assigned to everyone his employment, which descended from father to son. No one was permitted to have two professions, nor to adopt another. But there was one occupation which was obliged to be common to all, and this was the study of the laws and of wisdom. Ignorance of religion and of the political regulations of the country was excused in no condition of life. Moreover, every so like what we read about last night, the arrow hits, right? The idea is that the law is involved in every aspect of human life, and it's the source from which you might get virtue and wisdom. Moreover, every profession had a distinct assigned, I'm sorry, a district assigned to it. By whom? Amongst good laws, one of the best things was that everybody was taught to observe them. By whom? He keeps asking. Egypt abounded with wonderful inventions, and nothing was neglected which could render life comfortable and tranquil. Thus, men, according to Basson, derive nothing from themselves. Patriotism, wealth, inventions, husbandry, science, all come to them by the operations of the laws or by kings. All they have to do is to be passive. It is on this ground that Bossuet takes exception when Diodorus accuses the Egyptians of rejecting wrestling and music. How is that possible, says he, since these arts were invented by Trismegistus, Trismegistus. It is the same with the Persians. One of the first cares of the prince was to encourage agriculture. As there were poets established for the regulation of the armies, So there were officers for the superintending of rural works. The respect with which the Persians were inspired for royal authority was excessive. The Greeks, although full of mind, were no less strangers to their own responsibilities, so much so that of themselves, like dogs and horses, they would not have ventured upon the most simple games. In a classical sense, it is an undisputed thing that everything comes to the people from without. Quote, the Greeks, naturally full of spirit and courage, had been early cultivated by kings and colonies who had come from Egypt. From them, they had learned the exercise of the body, foot races and horses and chariot races. And the best thing that the Egyptians had taught them was to become docile and to allow themselves to be formed by the laws for the public good. This is clearly, definitely a Greek notion, maybe not in parts of Athens, but parts of Athens which were forced to drink poison, perhaps. Fenelon, reared in the study and admiration of antiquity and a witness, well, I mean, Plato certainly also had a totalitarian vision. Let's not get into the Plato conversation right now. Fenelon, reared in the study and admiration of antiquity and a witness of the power of Louis XIV, Fenelon naturally adopted the idea that mankind should be passive and that its misfortunes and its prosperities, its virtues and its vices are caused by the external influence that is exercised upon it by the law or by the makers of the law. Thus, in his Utopia of Salentum, he brings the men with their interests, their faculties, their desires, and their possessions under the absolute direction of the legislator. So now we see why in video one yesterday, when we read the first part, he spent so much time setting up his natural law, state of nature theory. Again, we're not arguing for or against it, but we can see how these two impulses are opposed to each other, right? For Bastiat, imagine a man naked in the woods, born and living there. What the heck is his situation? Well, he has a personality, he has some faculties, he has some abilities, and he has whatever property he can garner by exercising them, right? Maybe he'll turn something into a garden and he'll get the fruits of that garden. Those things are given to him by God before the state shows up. This opposite perspective, the one of Lycurgus and the one that he's taking shots at right now as the source of a lot of the fault of the socialist perspective, is the idea that the state actually comes first and you don't have civilized people unless they be political animals. We're not picking sides on that. We're noticing the debate. Thus, in his Utopia of Salentum, he brings the men with their interests, their faculties, their desires, and their possessions under the absolute direction of the legislator. Whatever the subject may be, they themselves have no voice in it. The prince judges for them. The nation is just a shapeless mass, of which the prince is the soul. In him reside the thought, the foresight, the principle of all organization, of all progress. On him, therefore, rests all the responsibility. Right? This is most nations. In proof of this assertion, I might transcribe the whole of the 10th book of the Telemachus. I refer the reader to it, and shall content myself with quoting some passages taken at random from this celebrated work, to which, in every other respect, I am the first to render justice. With the astonishing credulity that characterizes the classics, Fenelon, against the authority of reason and of facts, admits the general felicity of the Egyptians and attributes it not to their own wisdom, but to that of their kings. We could not turn our eyes to the two shores without perceiving rich towns and country seats, agreeably situated, fields that were covered every year without intermission with golden crops, meadows full of flocks, laborers bending under the weight of fruits that the earth lavished on its cultivators, and shepherds who made the echoes around repeat the soft sounds of their pipes and flutes. Happy, said Mentor, is that people who is governed by a wise king. Mentor afterwards desired me to remark that happiness and abundance was spread over all the country of Egypt, where 22,000 cities might be counted. He admired the excellent police regulations of the cities, the justice administered in favor of the poor against the rich, the good education of the children who were accustomed to obedience, labor, and the love of arts and letters, the exactness with which all the ceremonies of religion were performed, the disinterestedness, the desire of honor, the fidelity to men, and the fear of the gods with which every father inspired his children. He could not sufficiently admire the prosperous state of the country. Happy, said he, is the people whom a wise king rules in such a manner. Fenelon, Fenelon's idyll on Crete is still more fascinating. Mentor is made to say, quote, all that you will see in this wondrous island is the result of the laws of Minos. The education that the children receive renders the body healthy and robust. They are accustomed from the first to a frugal and a laborious life. It is supposed that all the pleasures of sense enervate the body and the mind. No other pleasure is presented to them but that of being invincible by virtue, that of acquiring much glory. There, they punish three vices that go unpunished amongst other people: ingratitude, dissimulation, and avarice. As to pomp and dissipation, there is no need to punish these, for they are unknown in Crete. No costly furniture, no magnificent clothing, no delicious feasts, no gilded palaces are allowed. It reminds us of what we read about Sparta with Lycurgus last night. It is thus that Mentor prepares his scholar to mold and manipulate, doubtless with the most philanthropic intentions, the people of Ithaca. And to confirm him in these ideas, he gives him the example of Salentum. So we receive our first political notions. We are taught to treat men very much as Oliver de Serres teaches farmers to manage and mix the soil. Montesquieu says, to sustain the spirit of commerce, it is necessary that all the laws should favor it, that these same laws, by their regulations and in dividing the fortunes in proportion as commerce enlarges them, should place every poor citizen in sufficiently easy circumstances to enable him to work like the others, and every rich citizen in such mediocrity that he must work in order to retain and or to acquire. Thus, the laws are to dispose of all fortunes. Quote, although in a democracy, real equality be the soul of the state, yet it is so different to establish that an extreme exactness in this matter would not always be desirable. It is sufficient that a census be established to reduce or fix the differences to a certain point, after which it is for particular laws to equalize, as it were, the inequality by burdens imposed upon the rich and reliefs granted to the poor. Here again, we see the equalization of fortunes by law, that is, by force. Quote, there were in Greece two kinds of republics. One was military, as Sparta, the other commercial, as Athens. So everybody misgets Sparta, don't they? In the one, it was wished by whom? That the citizens should be idle. In the other, the love of labor was encouraged. It is worth our while to pay a little attention to the extent of genius required by these legislators, that we may see how, by confounding all the virtues, they showed their wisdom to the world. Lycurgus, blending theft with the spirit of justice, the hardest slavery with extreme liberty, the most atrocious sentiments with the greatest moderation, gave stability to his city. He seemed to deprive it of all its resources, arts, commerce, money, and walls. There was ambition without the hope of rising. There were natural sentiments where the individual was neither child nor husband nor father. Chastity, even, was deprived of modesty. By this road, Sparta was led on to grandeur and to glory. The phenomenon that we observe in the institutions of Greece has been seen in the midst of the degeneracy and corruption of our modern times. An honest legislator has formed a people where probity has appeared as natural as bravery among the Spartans. Mr. Penn is a true Lycurgus. And although the former had peace for his object and the latter war, they resemble each other in the singular path along which they have led their people, in their influence over free men, in the prejudices which they have overcome, the passions they have subdued. Paraguay furnishes us with another example. Society has been accused of the crime of regarding the pleasure of commanding as the only good of life, but it will always be a noble thing to govern men by making them happy. Those who desire to form similar institutions will establish community of property as in the Republic of Plato. The same reverence. So, all of this high minded classical education is what he's taking a shot at right now. And he's saying, look, the problem that you're having here is that you're glorying in the idea of enslaving all your people so that you can prove that you're the clever one who made everybody happy and lived a good life. Those who desire to form similar institutions will establish community of property, as in the Republic of Plato, the same reverence as he enjoined for the gods, separation from strangers, from the preservation of for the preservation of morality, and make the city and not the citizens create commerce. They should give our arts without our luxury, our wants without our desires. Vulgar infatuation may exclaim if it likes, it is Montesquieu, magnificent, sublime. I am not afraid to express my opinion and to say, what? You have the gall to call that fine? It is frightful. It is abominable. And these extracts, which I might multiply, show that according to Montesquieu, the persons, the liberties, the property, mankind itself are nothing but grist for the mill of the sagacity of lawgivers. Now he wants to deal with Rousseau. Although this politician, the paramount authority of the Democrats, makes the social edifice rest upon the general will, no one has so completely admitted the hypothesis of the entire passiveness of human nature in the presence of the lawgiver. Quote, if it is true that a great prince is a rare thing, how much more so must a great lawgiver be? For the former has only to follow the pattern proposed to him by the latter. This latter is the engineer who invents the machine. The former is merely the workman who sets it in motion. Okay. And what part have men to act in all this? Asks Bastiat. That of the machine, which is set in motion. Or rather, are they not the brute matter of which the machine is made? Thus, between the legislator and the prince, between the prince and his subjects, there are the same relations as those that exist between the agricultural writer and the agriculturalist and the clod. At what a vast height, then, is the politician placed, who rules over legislators themselves and teaches them their trade in such imperative terms as the following quote, would you give consistency to the state, bring the extremes together as much as possible, suffer neither wealthy persons nor beggars, if the soil is poor and barren or the country too much confined for its inhabitants, turn to industry and the arts, whose productions you will exchange for the provisions which you require. On a good soil On a good soil, if you are short of inhabitants, give all your attention to agriculture, which multiplies men, and banish the arts, which only serve to depopulate the country. Pay attention to extensive and convenient coasts. Cover the sea with vessels, and you will have a brilliant and short existence. If your seas wash only inaccessible rocks, let the people be barbarous and eat fish. They will live more quietly, perhaps better, and most certainly more happily. In short, besides these maxims, which are common to all, every people has its own particular circumstances which demand a legislation peculiar to itself. It was thus that the Hebrews formerly and the Arabs more recently had religion for their principal object. That of the Athenians was literature, that of Carthage and Tyre, commerce, of Rhodes, naval affairs, of Sparta, war, and of Rome, virtue. The author of the Spirit of Laws has shown the art by which the legislator should frame his institutions towards each of these objects. But if the legislator, mistaking his object, should take up a principle different from that which arises from the nature of things, if one should tend to slavery and the other to liberty, if one to wealth and the other to population, one to peace and the other to conquest, the laws will insensibly become enfeebled. The constitution will be impaired, and the state will be subject to incessant agitations until it is destroyed or becomes changed, and invisible. An invincible nature regains her empire. Ooh, that's well put, actually. Okay, but if nature is sufficiently invincible to regain its empire, why does not Rousseau admit that it had no need of the legislator to gain its empire from the beginning? Why does he not allow that by obeying their own impulse, men would of themselves apply agriculture to a fertile district and commerce to extensive and commoditous posts without the interference of a Lycurgus, a Solon, or a Rousseau, who would undertake it at the risk of deceiving themselves. Be that as it may, we see with what a terrible responsibility Rousseau invests inventors, institutors, conductors, and manipulators of societies. He is therefore very exacting with regard to them. He who dares to undertake the institutions of a people ought to feel that he can, as it were, transform every individual, who is by himself a perfect and solitary whole, receiving his life and being from a larger whole of which he forms a part. He must feel that he can change the constitution of man to fortify it and substitute a social and moral existence for the physical and independent one that we have all received from nature. In a word, he must deprive man of his own powers to give him others that are foreign to him. Poor human nature. What would become of its dignity if it were entrusted to the disciples of Rousseau? Now he's going to deal with Reynal, just to expose that he's not wrong in saying that this is how these people are thinking. The climate, that is, the air and the soil, is the first element for the legislator. His resources prescribe to him his duties. First, he must consult his local position. A population dwelling upon maritime shores must have laws fit for navigation. If the colony is located in an inland region, a legislator must provide for the nature of the soil and for its degree of fertility. It is more, see, he's trying to underline that these guys are starting from the opposite starting point that he started his essay from. What comes first, the chicken or the egg here? Is man endowed by his creator with faculties and capacities and the right to make the world a slightly better place to the degree that he has a capacity to do so and to keep the benefits of that un, according to his will, right? Does he have the right to life, liberty, and property? Or is there no such thing as a man except what the legislator determines him to be? Does the state emerge, as Bastiat says, because individual people combine and give up a little bit of their God-given power and sovereignty in order to provide for the common defense of all and to oppose the worst parts of human nature? Is government born out of opposition to the worst parts of human nature and should be restricted to only that? Or are there no such things as men except what the states determine them to be? Does the state have virtue and dignity within itself, and then it bestows that upon men? Or do men start as the fundamental units of dignity and nobility, and do they come together to create and bestow that upon the state to some degree? He say this is the main problem. This is why, because you're all wrong about that, we're heading in the wrong direction in 1850. We're moving in the wrong direction where it's going to be nothing but corruption eventually. It is more especially in the distribution of property that the wisdom of legislation will appear. As a general rule, and moving away from where the founders started, which was more in that place. And in every country, when a new colony is founded, land should be given to each man sufficient to the support of his family. In an uncultivated island, which you are colonizing with children, it will be needful to let the germs of truth expand to the development of reason. But when you establish old people in a new country, the skill consists in only allowing it those injurious opinions and customs which it is impossible to cure and correct. If you wish to prevent them from being perpetuated, you will act upon the rising generation by a general and public education of the children. A prince or legislator ought never to found a colony without previously sending wise men there to instruct the youth. In a new colony, every facility is open to the precautions of the legislator who desires to purify the tone and the manners of the people. If he has genius and virtue, the lands and the men that are at his disposal will inspire his soul with a plan of society that a writer can only vaguely trace, and in a way that would be subject to the instability of all hypotheses, which are varied and complicated by an infinity of circumstances too difficult to foresee and to combine. But that great legislator can do what the writer wouldn't be able to. Okay. One would think it was a professor of agriculture who was saying to his pupils, the climate, continuing the quotation, the climate is the only rule for the agriculturalist. His resources dictate to him his duties. The first thing he has to consider is his local position. If he is on a clayey soil, he must do so and so, so and so. If he is to contend with sand, this is the way in which he must set about it. Every facility is open to the agriculturalist who wishes to clear and improve his soil if he only has the skill. The manure, which he has at his disposal, will suggest to him a plan of operation, which a professor can only vaguely trace, and in a way that would be subject to the uncertainty of all hypotheses, which vary and are complicated by an infinity of circumstances too difficult to foresee and to combine. But ho, sublime writers, deign to remember sometimes that this clay, this sand, this manure of which you are disposing in so arbitrary a manner are men, your equals, intelligent and free beings like yourselves, who have received from God, as you have, the faculty of seeing, of foreseeing, of thinking, and of judging for themselves. All right, so he's enraged by all this. Mabley. He is supposing the laws to be worn out by time and by the neglect of security, and continues thus. He says, quote, under these circumstances, we must be convinced that the bonds of government are slack. Give them a new tension. It is the reader who is addressed, and the evil will be remedied. Think less of punishing the faults than of encouraging the virtues that you want. By this method, you will bestow upon your republic the vigor of youth. Through ignorance of this, a free people has lost its liberty. But if the evil has made so much way that the ordinary magistrates are unable to remedy it effectually, have recourse to an extraordinary magistracy, whose time should be short and its power considerable. The imagination of the citizens requires to be impressed. In this style, he goes on through 20 volumes. There was a time when, under the influence of teaching like this, which is the foundation of classical education, everyone was for placing himself beyond and above mankind for the sake of arranging, organizing, and instituting it in his own way. Condillac, as the next example. Take upon yourself, my lord, the character of Lycurgus or of Solon. Before you finish reading this essay, amuse yourself with giving hearts to some wild people in America or Africa. These roving men in fixed dwellings, teach them to keep flocks. Endeavor to envelop the social qualities nature has implanted in them. Make them begin to practice the duties of humanity. Cause the pleasures of the passions to become distasteful to them by punishments, and you will see these barbarians, with every plan of your legislation, lose a vice and gain a virtue. All these people have had laws, but few among them have been happy. Why is this? Because legislators have almost always been ignorant of the object of society, which is to unite families by a common interest. Impartiality in law consists in two things: in establishing equality in the fortunes and in the dignity of the citizens. In proportion to the degree of equality established by the laws, the dearer will they become to every citizen. How can avarice, ambition, disposition, idleness, sloth, envy, hatred, or jealousy agitate men who are equal in fortune and dignity, and to whom the laws leave no hope of disturbing their equality? What has been told you of the Republic of Sparta ought to enlighten you on this question. No other state has had laws more in accordance with the order of nature or of equality. There's something to be ironed out here, right? We just read Lycurgus last night. That's a totalitarian state. Bastiat is saying you're reading Lycurgus and saying there's never been more equality. There's never been more equality. There's never been more liberty than that. The people might lose their liberty if you don't legislate every aspect of their being. What the hell are you talking about? It is not to be wondered at that the 17th and 18th centuries should have looked upon the human race as inert matter, ready to receive everything: form, figure, impulse, movement, and life from a great prince or a great legislator or a great genius. These ages were weird. Now we saw when we were reading Lycurgus that last night that he was more than a legislator. There was something of a religious leader in him for sure. And he was founding a culture as well as, he didn't codify any of these laws. He made like three grand pronouncements of the better ways of living, and he made a lot of regulations as habits, rather than things that needed to be enforced by anything other than the people as a culture. So anyway, well, we can look into that question more. But these 1800s, these 19th century thinkers are saying, "Oh, look, I'll get together and theorize about the best way to organize everything." And it's like, well, maybe you're no Lycurgus might be the answer, but let's continue. It is not to be wondered at that the 17th and 18th centuries have looked upon the human race as inert matter, ready to receive everything form, figure, impulse, movement, and life from a great prince or a great legislator or a great genius. These ages were reared in the study of antiquity, and antiquity presents everywhere in Egypt, Persia, Greece, and Rome the spectacle of a few men molding mankind according to their fancy, and mankind to this end enslaved by force or by imposture. And what does this prove? That because men in society are improvable, error, ignorance, despotism, slavery, and superstition must be more prevalent in early times? The mistake of the writers quoted above is not that they have asserted this fact, but that they have proposed it as a rule for the admiration and imitation of future generations. Their mistake has been with an inconceivable absence of discernment and upon the faith of a puerile conventionalism that they have admitted what is inadmissible, viz., the grandeur, dignity, morality, and well being of the artificial societies of the ancient world. They have not understood that time produces and spreads enlightenment, and that in proportion to the increase of enlightenment, right ceases to be upheld by force, and society regains possession of herself. And in fact, what is the political work that we are endeavoring to promote? It is no other than the instinctive effort of every people towards liberty. And what is liberty? Whose name can make every heart beat and which can agitate the world, but the union of all liberties, the liberty of conscience, of education, of association, of the press, of movement, of labor, and of exchange. In other words, of free exercise for all of all the inoffensive faculties, and again, in other words, the destruction of all despotisms, even of legal despotism, and the reduction of law to its only rational sphere, which is to regulate the individual right of legitimate defense or to repress injustice. This tendency of the human race, it must be admitted, is greatly thwarted, particularly in our country, by the fatal disposition resulting from the classical teaching and common to all politicians of placing themselves beyond mankind to arrange, organize, and regulate it according to their fancy. For while society is struggling to realize liberty, the great men who place themselves at its head, imbued with the principles of the 17th and 18th centuries, think only of subjecting it to the philanthropic despotisms of their social inventions and making it bear with docility, according to the expression of Rousseau, the yoke of public felicity as pictured in their own imaginations. This was particularly the case in 1789. No sooner was the old system destroyed than society was to be submitted to other artificial arrangements, always with the same starting point, the omnipotence of the law. A few examples. Saint Just. The legislator commands the future. It is for him to will for the good of mankind. It is for him to make men what he wishes them to be. Robespierre. The function of government is to direct the physical and moral powers of the nation towards the object of its institution. Beloved Verenis. A people who are to be restored to liberty must be formed anew. Ancient prejudices must be destroyed. Antiquated customs changed. Depraved affections corrected. Inveterate vices eradicated. For this, a strong force and a vehement impulse will be necessary, citizens. The inflexible austerity of Lycurgus created the firm basis of the Spartan Republic. The feeble and trusting disposition of Solon plunged Athens into slavery. This parallel contains the whole science of government. We have been reading Lycurgus, and we can read those things ourselves and see if we can't get wiser insights than the objects of Bastiat's targets here. But anyway, Le Pelletier says, considering the extent of human degradation, I am convinced of the necessity of effecting an entire regeneration of the race, and if I may so express myself, of creating a new people. Men, therefore, says Bastiat, are nothing but raw material. It is not for them to will their own improvement. They are not capable of it. According to St. Just, it is only the legislator who is. Men are merely to be what he wills that they should be. According to Robespierre, who copies Rousseau literally, the legislator is to begin by assigning the aim of the institutions of the nation. After this, the government has only to direct all its physical and moral forces towards this end. All this time, the nation itself is to remain perfectly passive. And Billaud Varennes would teach us that it ought to have no prejudices, affections, or wants, but such as are authorized by the legislator. He even goes so far as to say that the inflexible austerity of the man is the basis of the republic. We have seen that in cases where the evil is so great that the ordinary magistrates are unable to remedy it, Mabley recommends a dictatorship to promote virtue. Have recourse, says he, to an extraordinary magistracy whose time shall be short and its power considerable. The imagination of the people requires to be impressed. This doctrine has not been neglected. Listen to Robespierre. The principle of the Republican government is virtue, and the means to be adopted during its establishment is terror. We want to substitute in our country morality for self indulgence, probity for honor, principles for customs, duties for decorum, the empire of reason for the tyranny of fashion, contempt of vice for contempt of misfortune, pride for insolence, greatness of soul for vanity, love of glory for love of money, good people for good company, merit for intrigue, genius for wit, truth for glitter, the charm of happiness for the weariness of pleasure, the greatness of man for the littleness of the great, a magnanimous, powerful, happy people for one that is easy, frivolous, degraded. This is to say, we would substitute all the virtues and miracles of a republic for all the vices and absurdities of monarchy. As you say at the beginning, we must use terror to do this. At what a vast height above the rest of mankind does Robespierre place himself here. And observe the arrogance with which he speaks. He is not content with expressing a desire for a great renovation of the human heart. He does not even expect such a result from a regular government. No, he intends to effect it himself and by means of terror. The object of the discourse from which his puerile and laborious mass of antitheses is extracted was to exhibit the principles of morality that ought to direct a revolutionary government. Moreover, when Robespierre asks for a dictatorship, it is not merely for the purpose of repelling a foreign enemy or of putting down factions. It is that he may establish by means of terror and as a preliminary to the operation of the Constitution his own principles of morality. He pretends to nothing short of extirpating from the country by means of terror, self interest, honor, customs, decorum, fashion, vanity, the love of money, good company, intrigue, wit, luxury, and misery. It is not until after he, Robespierre, shall have accomplished these miracles, as he rightly calls them, that he will allow the law to regain her empire. Truly, it would be well if these visionaries, who think so much of themselves and so little of mankind, who hi, I just found you on my YouTube homepage. Okay, great. So, for those who are just joining, we are reading Bastiat's The Law, and we're reading it. Let's finish this paragraph first, and we'll catch everybody up. would only be content with trying to reform themselves. The task would be arduous enough for them. In general, however, these gentlemen, the reformers, legislators, and politicians, do not desire to exercise an immediate disposition over mankind. No, they are too moderate and too philanthropic for that. They only contend for the despotism, the absolutism, the omnipotence of the law. They aspire only to make the law. To show how universal this strange disposition has been in France, I had need not only to have copied the whole of the work of Mably, Raynal, Rousseau, Fenelon, and to have made long extracts from Bossuet and Montesquieu, but to have given the entire transactions of the sittings of the convention. I shall do no such thing, however, but merely refer the reader to them. No wonder the idea suited Bonaparte so well. He embraced it with ardor and put it in practice with energy, playing the part of a chemist. Europe was to him the ma the material for his experiments. But this material reacted against him. More than half undeceived, Bonaparte at St. Helena seemed to admit that there is some initiative in every people, and he became less hostile to liberty. Yet this did not prevent him from giving this lesson to his son in his will. To govern is to diffuse morality, education, and well-being. All right, let's pause. We're almost done. This is our second day of reading Bastiat. The first one's only available on X. I'll find a way to upload it to YouTube maybe eventually. We're reading it in the context of yesterday's Scott Adams Coffee, where he talked about the systemic problem with the system of the United States. And what we read in the first half of this essay was Bastiat in 1850 describing exactly what was brilliant about the founding of the United States and exactly where the cracks were and exactly where it would lead. And where it's led to is every single group of people of necessity and in their own immediate self-interest having to lobby the government for advantage for themselves against everyone else, what he calls the plunder of all by all, which is necessarily the bankruptcy of all. And the degrees to which this happens is necessarily a diminution of the sum total of value and wealth that a people have. What we read last night was Lycurgus, and we read Plutarch on Lycurgus, and tonight we're going to read Aegis, because what we're going to see is that a nation which is founded philosophically in its constitution, and right now Bastiat is taking aim against those who would want to shape humanity in the image that they desire through their misunderstanding or perhaps their focusing too much. It sounds like he's actually against the classical education here on thinkers like Lycurgus and entities like that who think that they too can reform France in the way that they want to, and it's leading to terror and totalitarianism and bankruptcy and horribleness and revolution after revolution. And he's saying, look, the main problem is this: none of you understand the proper role of the state. The state is conceived and born in opposition to the worst elements of human nature. It's there to stop your neighbor from stealing, raping, murdering, or you from doing any of those things. It's born, though, in opposition to humanity. And if you look for an ultimate solution in the state, you will inevitably result in the grinding up, in the viewing of humanity as the raw material for your experiment, and the eventual grinding up of millions of people in those experiments in a effort to value something other than humanity. Now, the point of the Apollo story, which we read a long time ago on the YouTube channel, you can find it, the Apollo Daphne story, is to say Apollo learns his lesson. The point of these types of state-like solutions are in service to something that you cannot demand it be contented and happy with what you've done. It's in service to something else. That's why he puts the laurel wreaths on everything and why Cupid's prophecy against him comes true, that all the good he's accomplished will be pointed at Cupid rather than him. He has done some good. The state is there for a purpose and it serves to stave off a great deal of suffering. But if it becomes an end in itself, if Apollo is not holding back the reins as he always is doing in all the statues and all the paintings, if instead, like Phaeton, his son, he's using them as a whip, it's going to be the destruction of everyone and new fires will come into the world. The tripartite part of the analysis from earlier that we read yesterday, which is also available on X and not on YouTube yet. Maybe we'll find a way to get it there. But the first half of this essay is that in America, so in 1850, he comes over as a philosopher to study the American situation. He says, wow, this is the best setup we've ever had on earth so far. It's got 2 really bad sins, the slavery one and, this other one, and this other one's gonna destroy it in the following way. This other sin is that there's cracks in the system where one group of people decide that instead of competing fairly and just doing the best they can with all of the natural oppositions and difficulties of making the world a better place that they face, they can shortcut and cheat by finding a politician who's worried about running for reelection and say, hey, if you pass a law that favors us at the expense of everyone else or at this other group or whatever, we'll be sure to enthusiastically come out and vote for you. The politician says, well, sure, I'm definitely going to do that because I'm worried about running for reelection and staying in power. So they make that deal. And it's like it kind of works a little bit, except that it's overall damaging the general well being of everybody. But it's more primarily and immediately just damaging everyone slightly at the expense of one small group that becomes very enthusiastic. But what inevitably happens is that every other group has to unionize, and every other group eventually does unionize. And so in 1850, he's describing the future up to where we are right now in the system. What we're going to read tonight is gonna be really great. We're gonna read Aegis. So we read Lycurgus last night. Later tonight, we're gonna read Aegis, which is a time when this greatly founded nation state, this city state that was founded on these philosophical principles and lasted 500 years, twice as long as the American political tradition, which, by the way, is, I think, the oldest political tradition in the world today, right? There's other countries, but they've had revolutions more recently than we have. But this great nation state that lasted 500 years also had the exact same process of corruption. And then one wealthy individual, one son of a wealthy man who became very successful inside that system, rose up and joined politics for no reason near after he was already successful. And he said, you know, everybody, this sucks. I mean, I'm doing well enough, but I mean, this sucks. It sucks for everybody. It's all necessarily worse for all of us, but we all have to keep pushing in this direction. Both the left and the right, as Bastiat is pointing out, is pushing in this direction. Why don't we just go back to where it was before and everybody just says, fuck yeah, let's do it. We'll all do it together. We can all reset together. So we're going to read about that tonight. Right now, let's finish the analysis from Bastiat on what's good and bad and what's going on here. So, after all this, I hardly need show by fastidious quotations the opinions of Morley, Babeuf, Owen, Saint Simon, and Fourier. I shall confine myself to a few extracts from Louis Blanc's book on the organization of labor. Quote, in our project, society receives the impulse of power. And what does the impulse of power, and what does that impulse, the impulse that power gives to society consist? Asks Bastiat. And in imposing upon it the project of Mr. Louis Blanc. On the other hand, society is the human race. The human race, then, is to receive its impulse from Mr. Louis Blanc. It is at liberty to do so or not, it will be said. Of course, the human race is at liberty to take advice from anybody, whoever it may be. But this is not the way in which Mr. Louis Blanc understands the thing. He means that his project should be converted into law and consequently forcibly imposed by power. Quote, in our project, the state has only to give a legislation to labor by means of which the industrial movement may and ought to be accomplished in all liberty. It, the state, merely places society on an incline, that is all, that it may descend when once it is placed there by the mere force of things and by the natural course of the established mechanism. What is this incline? One indicated by Mr. Louis Blanc? Does it not lead to an abyss? No, it leads to happiness. Why then? Does not society go there of itself? Because it does not know what it wants, and it requires an impulse. What gives it this impulse? Power. And who is to give the impulse of power? The inventor of the machine, Mr. Louis Blanc. We shall never get out of this circle. Mankind passive, and a great man moving it by the intervention of the law. Once on this incline, will society enjoy something like liberty? Without a doubt. And what is liberty? Let's see what he says. Once for all, liberty consists not only in the right granted, but in the power given to man to exercise to develop his faculties under the empire of justice and under the protection of the law. And this is no vain distinction. There is a deep meaning in it, and its consequences are imponderable. For when once it is admitted that man, to be truly free, must have the power to exercise and develop his faculties, it follows that every member of society has a claim upon it for such education as shall enable his faculties to display themselves and for the tools of labor without which human activity can find no scope. Now, by whose invention is society to give to each of its members the requisite education and the necessary tools of labor, unless by that of the state? Thus, says Bastiat, he's saying, liberty is power. And what does this power consist? In possessing education and tools of labor. Who is to give education and tools of labor? Society. Who owes them? But whose in intervention is society? By whose intervention is society to give tools of labor to those who do not possess them? By the intervention of the state. From whom is the state to obtain them? No answer. It is for the reader to answer this question and to notice whither all this tends, right? He's saying the impulse he's against here is the totalitarian impulse, and it's a temptation and a mistake of both the right and the left. And he's saying if you see the dignity and the sovereignty of man as primary and the state as something that can be used to create the possibilities of a free market and to allow their liberty to flourish, but something that is constituted out of their coming together by agreement and consent. This is the founding fathers' philosophy of the United States. You have the opposite view of these individuals who say, no, from the state springs all, including your identity, your perspective, your opinions, your motivations, everything. You're just nothing. And you're the product of the state. And I, the great statesman, the great legislator, I don't know how I became a different sort of creature than the other men, but let's not ask that question. I'm the one who's going to know what direction to push you all towards. One of the strangest phenomena of our time, and one that will probably be a matter of astonishment for our descendants, is the doctrine which is founded upon this triple hypothesis: the radical passiveness of mankind, the omnipotence of the law, the infallibility of the legislator. This is the sacred symbol of the party that proclaims itself exclusively democratic. Well, sounds like he's writing to some of us today, huh? It is true that it professes also to be social, so far as it is democratic. It has an unlimited faith in mankind. Boy, let's read that and see if there's anybody who might hear these words. The strangest phenomena of our time, one of the strangest, one that will probably be a matter of astonishment to our descendants who look back on how fucking crazy we were, is the doctrine which is founded upon this triple hypothesis: the infinite malleability of mankind, right? They're just passive dirt that you can shape into a machine that you want. The omnipotence of the law, this totalitarian impulse, and the infallibility of the one who's got an idea that I should have the power and I'll fix everything. This is the sacred symbol of the party that proclaims itself exclusively democratic. Wow, why is that lowercase? It is true that it professes also to be social. So far as it is democratic, it has an unlimited faith in mankind. So far as it is social, it places mankind beneath the mud. Are political rights under discussion? I mean, if you can't notice those ironies, I said the left would appreciate the one part of this essay and the right another part. Both of you got to take your blows. You got to take your chastisement in this. This should be punching you in the chest if you're a leftist. Are political rights under discussion? Is a legislator to be chosen? Oh, then the people possess science by instinct. They are gifted with an admirable discernment. Their will is always right. The general will cannot err. Suffrage cannot be too universal. Nobody is under any responsibility to society. The will and the capacity to choose well are taken for granted. Okay, that's the one half. Can the people be mistaken? Are we not living in an age of enlightenment? What? Are the people to be forever led about by the nose? Have they not acquired their rights at the cost of effort and sacrifice? Right. So all There's this incredible hypocrisy he's pointing out, that all of these high-minded elitist perspectives are looking at humanity as the raw material for their experiments, and at the same time justifying their right to do everything by saying, "Hey, the people are upset. I got them all riled up and upset, and now I'm the spearheading of the great thing that these people who, as a tide, must always be correct, as a stampede." Have they not given sufficient proof of intelligence and wisdom? Are they not arrived at maturity? Are they not in a state to judge for themselves? Do they not know that know their own interests? Well, wait a minute. You say you have to tell them what their interests should be, but then you say, "But my right to do that is that they voted for me to be their tyrant, and they're clamoring for this sort of a thing, and so how dare you question them?" Do they not know their own interests? Is there a man or a class who would dare to claim the right of putting himself in the place of the people, of deciding and of acting for them? No, no, the people would be free, and they shall be so. They wish to conduct their own affairs, and they shall do so. But when once the legislator is duly elected, then indeed the style of his speech alters. The nation is sent back into passiveness, inertness, nothingness, and the legislator takes possession of omnipotence. It is for him to invent, for him to direct, for him to impel, for him to organize. Mankind has nothing to do but to submit. The hour of despotism has struck, and we must observe that this is decisive for the people just before so enlightened, so moral, so perfect, have no inclinations at all. Or if they have any, they all lead them downwards towards degradation. And yet they ought to have a little liberty. But are we not assured by Mr. Considerant that liberty leads fatally to monopoly? Are we not told that liberty is competition, and that competition, according to Mr. Louis Blanc, is a system of extermination for the people and of ruination for trade? For that reason, people are exterminated and ruined in proportion as they are free. Take, for example, Switzerland, Holland, England, and the United States, he says with sarcasm. Does not Mr. Louis Blanc tell us again that competition leads to monopoly, and that for the same reason, cheapness leads to exorbitant prices, that competition tends to drain the sources of consumption and diverts production to a destructive activity, that competition forces production to increase and consumption to decrease, whence it follows that free people produce for the sake of not consuming, and that there is nothing but oppression and madness among them, and that it is absolutely necessary for Mr. Louis Blanc to see to it what sort of liberty should be allowed to men. Liberty of conscience, but we should see them all profiting by the permission to become atheists. Liberty of education, but parents would be paying professors to teach their sons immorality and error. Besides, if we are to believe Mr. Tears, education is, if left to the national liberty, would cease to be national. And we would be educating our children in the ideas of the Turks or Hindus, instead of which, thanks to the legal despotism of the universities, they have the good fortune to be educated in the noble ideas of the Romans. Liberty, liberty of labor? Oh, but this is only competition, whose effect is to leave all products unconsumed, to exterminate the people, and to ruin the tradesmen. The liberty of exchange, perhaps? No, but it is well known that the protectionists have shown over and over again that a man will inevitably be ruined when he exchanges freely, and that to become rich, it is necessary to exchange without liberty. Liberty of association, perhaps, but according to the socialist doctrine, liberty and association exclude each other, for the liberty of men is attacked just to force them to associate, right? That was an interesting point he made earlier. Forced brotherhood. Ugh. You already are brothers one to another, but the idea that you're going to force fraternity, you're going to force love. Anyway, you must see then that the socialist democrats cannot, in conscience, allow men any liberty, because by their own nature, they tend in every instance to all kinds of degradation and demoralization. We are therefore left to conjecture in this case upon what foundation universal suffrage is claimed for them with so much importunity. Uh, The people require you to moralize them through your tyranny, but every man should vote, because I can totally brainwash them into voting for me so I can have my project. I mean, what? Well, you don't want them to vote? Jesus. Out of one side of your mouth, you're demanding the rights of everyone to vote, and out of the other side, you're acting as though they couldn't even have desires without you telling them what to desire. All right, the pretensions of organizers suggest another question, which I have often asked them, and to which I am not aware that I have ever received an answer, since the natural tendencies of mankind are so bad that it is not safe to allow them liberty. How comes it to pass that the tendencies of organizers are always good? Do not the legislators and their agents form a part of the human race? Do they consider that they are composed of different materials than the rest of mankind? They say that society, when left to itself, rushes to inevitable destruction because its instincts are perverse. They presume to stop it in its downward course and to give it a better direction. Well, whence, where do they come from? Aren't you also these men inclined to destruction and perversion? And you're now going to be in charge of everything to stop the rest of us who are men in in your model. And where'd you come from? And what's sad is in 1850 he's writing this, and he's talking about the founding of America, and he's saying, "Holy cow, you've got these founders who understood what Benjamin Franklin said. If men were angels, they would need not governments. And if governments were run by angels, we would need not constitutions. That the conception of a power structure should be with restriction, with constraint, with separations of powers and checks and balances and limitations on what you can do. The whole thing should be the pulling back of the reins, the holding back of the reins." And we get one bloody revolution after another in France. And America is headed for the reasons he described to this inevitable result as well as the cracks of the corruption that he described earlier in the essay lead us in exactly this direction with no one scheming to make it happen. No evil shadow group of people. There are people in shadows, but they're not the ones making this happen. The whole thing is going in that direction for the reasons that he explained before. And we could turn it all around if we all decided as one that we just wanted things to be better for each of us and every one of us, which they would be had we not degraded in this way. They say that society, when left to itself, rushes to inevitable destruction because its instincts are perverse. They presume to stop it. They have, therefore, received from heaven intelligence and virtues that place them beyond and above mankind. Let them show their title to this superiority. They would be our shepherds, and we are to be their flock. This arrangement presupposes in them a natural superiority, the right to which we are fully justified in calling upon them to prove. You must observe that I am not contending against their right to invent social combinations, to propagate them, to recommend them, and to try them upon themselves at their own expense and risk. But I do dispute their right to impose them upon us through the medium of the law, that is by force and by public taxes. So one of the best things about Bastiat's analysis, and we've seen this a number of times now throughout the whole thing, it's subtle. Okay? It's subtle. It's he's seeing a grand problem here and he's able to cut. I'm not saying he's the most profound person in the world, but he's able to cut between bone and marrow and say, okay, here's what's wrong on this side of the argument. Here's what's wrong on this side of the argument. I'm not saying you don't have a right to come up with all sorts of creative ideas and to A B test them. What you don't have a right to do is use the wrong machine, the machine of force, to get liberty. It's born in direct opposition to that. You will not get that from that direction. I would not insist upon the capitists, the Fourierists, the Proudhonians, the academics, the protectionists renouncing their own particular ideas. I would only have them renounce the idea that it is common to them all, that is common to them all, viz., that of subjecting us by force to their own categories and rankings, to their own social laboratories, to their ever inflating bank, to their Greco Roman morality, and to their commercial restrictions. I would ask them to allow us the faculty of judging of their plans and not to oblige us to adopt them if we find that they hurt our interests or are repugnant to our consciences. We have to make one more point from earlier. One more time, we have to make this point. It's really important. I had said this at length yesterday in yesterday's video. Secularism was invented by the Christians who founded this nation. The United States, the whole silly debate of were they atheists and were they religious? Oh, I won't give the long version of the speech. Secularism was invented by them for the following reason. Imagine you took your religion seriously, your reading of the scriptures, your understanding of how to properly worship the divine, your teachings, your doctrines, all of that. You took it very seriously. And you thought to yourself, this is the best way I have found so far in order to live in harmony with the divine. And that instructs me in how to live in nature and in the body politic. You believe that you're right. And then you say the strangest thing that's ever been said. Something which took centuries for us to develop. There's I've read and studied the history of these ideas of liberty, and I'll tell you about them in a moment, but essentially what they are is one person arguing for the liberty to think a new thought that was considered heretical, and then immediately using force to impose that everybody has to agree with him within his domain and can't criticize him or think freely anymore. Again and again and again and again and again until finally you get the Jeffersonian revolution, the Jeffersonian notion that you cannot have that right to speak and think and inquire freely unless you demand it for everyone else as well. That took our species centuries to understand. And individuals, it takes them decades to understand if they ever understand it at all. You see it all the time with all the talking heads on the left and the right. Everybody's like, what about my right to speak what I want to speak? Well, you should be silenced because you're speaking too. Nobody gets the principle. Here's the principle of secularism, the separation, the wall of separation between church and state that was demanded by the religious, by the most religious. If I believe I have the best way to congregate and to worship, and you force people to sit next to me in the pews, and I don't know that they're even genuinely believers, you've destroyed my religion. If you force a tithe to come to my church because we're the church that's endorsed by the state, how do you know if there's been any effect? I want to model the best way of living. You can see the fruit of it, and maybe we'll get some converts. But I'd rather have few converts than have false, forced converts who require that the whole message be changed eventually, which will inevitably happen. The religious understood this. It's time that the political experimenters, that the academics, that the hospitals, the scientists understand their need for a separation between the state and themselves. Don't poison my discipline. Don't poison my great philosophical idea. Let me live it. Let me try to convert others. Let me see what effect it can have in the world. But don't create an artificial effect which demonizes it, poison it, slanders it, gives it a bad name for all time because it gets linked to a totalitarianism and destroys it. If you have an impulse in your silly mind and heart for a socialist way of living, go and live it. Be an example to others. Set up a commune. Don't say, I want the reins of government so I can whip everybody else into being just like this. You've poisoned whatever might have been great about your idea to begin with. We could say this to the fascists, and we don't have to just pick on the communists. We could say it to the racist Nazi fascists. You want to prove you're the child of Newton? Ooh, you've got the ethnicity that's so superior. Act like it. Do something with it. Stop trying to shortcut having to prove you're right because you're not. I mean, or because you all, the communists, the Nazis, everybody suspect you're not because of your insecurity, because of your hollow shallowness, because you don't really have the good motivations you'd like others to think you have, or the grandness of spirit that you want to pretend you have. Go and take the reins of the state to try to force it to be that way. Go be a child of Newton. Study harder. Don't be bored by reading, as one individual who used to come to our classes said, well, this is boring. I don't want to read all these things. Oh, but you're a child of Newton, Mr. White supremacist. You have no discipline of mind, but you're one of the superior ones. Act like it, God damn it. But you all want to grab Washington, D.C. to get an artificial endorsement of your bullshit theory on the extreme left or the extreme right or the whatever. And you're killing anything that could have been virtuous of your own program, if there was any at all, and you're causing nothing but hell for everybody else. All right. Let's finish this. To presume to have recourse to power and taxation besides being oppressive and unjust implies further the pernicious assumption that the organized is infallible and mankind incompetent. And if mankind is not competent to judge for itself, why do they talk so much about universal suffrage? This contradiction in ideas is unhappily to be found also in facts. And whilst the French nation has preceded all others in obtaining its rights, or rather its political claims, this has by no means prevented it from being more governed and directed and imposed upon and fettered and cheated than any other nation. It is also the one of all others where revolutions are constantly to be dreaded, and it is perfectly natural that it should be so. This is the main reason for reading this is he shows formulaically why this is inevitable. It isn't a mystery. This is how it has to be. And he touches upon America and why we are in the systemic problem we're in now and how we would get there step by step. He understands, or he has, let's not say understand, he has diagnosed the problem thusly. And if you can't understand the formula he's putting out, you're not even in the conversation to offer a solution to it. Even if you decide he's wrong, if you haven't yet examined and understood what he's saying, you're not even in the conversation with all your supposed solutions and who you think you should vote for and all that. So long as this idea is retained, which is admitted by all our politicians and so energetically expressed by Mr. Louis Blanc in these words, quote, when he says, society receives its impulse from power. So long as men consider themselves as capable, I've been reminded twice while reading that quote of Norm Macdonald in an interview saying that the thing he hates most is power, having it exercised over him or exercising it over others. I really feel you, man. I miss that fella. Okay, so long as men consider themselves as capable of feeling yet passive, incapable of raising themselves by their own discernment and by their own energy to any morality or well being, and while they expect everything from the law, in a word, while they admit that their relations with the state are the same as those of a flock with the shepherd, it is clear that the responsibility of power is immense. Fortune and misfortune, wealth and destitution, equality and inequality all proceed from it. It is charged with everything. It undertakes everything. It does everything. Therefore, it has to answer for everything. If we are happy, it has a right to claim our gratitude. If we are miserable, it alone must bear the blame. Are not our persons and property, in fact, at its disposal? You are the accessory. You are the raw material for a state project. You're not the constituent founding element of something greater. We're going to be doing a long class where we go line by line through Nietzsche's Zarathustra. It's the third year material, the core curriculum for that. We need a taste of that at this point. But he hated states and all the, well, anyway, are not our persons and property, in fact, at its disposal? Is not the law omnipotent in creating the educational monopoly it has undertaken to answer the expectations of fathers of families who have been deprived of liberty? And if these expectations are disappointed, who is at fault? In regulating industry, it has undertaken to make it prosper. Otherwise, it would have been absurd to deprive it of its liberty. And if it suffers, whose fault is it? In pretending to adjust the balance of commerce by the game of tariffs, it undertakes to make commerce prosper. And if so far from prospering, it is destroyed, whose fault is it? In granting its protection to maritime armaments in exchange for their liberty, it has undertaken to render them self sufficient. If they become burdensome, whose fault is it? He's kind of saying, look, if you guys really want to do this, who's going to be taking responsibility when you inevitably fail? Thus, there is not a grievance in the nation for which the government does not voluntarily make itself responsible. Is it any wonder that every failure threatens to cause a revolution? And what is the remedy proposed? To extend indefinitely the dominion of the law, i.e., the responsibility of government. This is a self feedback loop. It's going to keep going in that direction until you want to reset yourself back to 1776. He's said it a number of times now. This feeds itself. Every individual, even if they understand and agree with this, is pushing in that direction because they're in competition with the others who are getting an unfair advantage from the government being involved. So everybody's moving in that direction until you decide to un to detach yourself from the ratchet system and move all the way back to where we were. A great reset, which has happened in history, and we will be reading tonight about a historical event where a nation that lasted 500 years had this same slide into corruption for the same formulaic reasons that can be understood, just said, "What if we just went back and started again where we were?" And they just all chose to and did. It is possible. Is it any wonder that every failure threatens to have a revolution, responsibility of government? But if government undertakes to raise and to regulate wages and to be able to do it, and is not able to do it if it undertakes to assist all those who are in want, and it is not able to do it if it undertakes to provide work for every laborer, and is not able to do it if it undertakes to offer to the all who wish to borrow easy credit, and it is not able to do it, in words that we regret should escape the pen of Mr. Del Martine. The state considers that its mission is to enlighten, to develop, to enlarge, to strengthen, to spiritualize, and to sanctify the soul of the people. If it fails in this, is it not obvious that after every disappointment, which alas is more than probable, all right, maybe not inevitable, probable, there will be no less inevitable revolution? I shall now resume the subject of remarking that immediately after the economical part of the question and before the political part, a leading question presents itself, which is the following: what is law? What ought it to be? What is its domain? What are its limits? Where, in fact, does the prerogative of the legislator stop? I have no hesitation in answering. Law is common force organized to prevent injustice. In short, law is justice. It is not true that the legislator has absolute power over our persons and property, since they pre-exist. This is his state of nature. Again, we're not arguing for or against this, but the state of nature and the natural law theory is the philosophical perspective of the founding fathers. They were very well steeped in the ancient Greeks, and he's taken some real aim at the French understanding of classical education and at the explicit teachings within them of the great legislator defines what the people are. And they, remember Socrates saying, I must drink the poison. I have to obey the laws. I only exist because the laws allowed my parents to marry. I am the product of the state, right? He's saying there's an inversion here. The ancient mythological texts had it the other way around. The Christian, in the dialectic between things, the Christian has something to say here. The state in the ancient mythological texts, you've got Remus and Romulus, fratricidal brothers. The first person to build a city in the Bible was Cain. Fratricide, the worst elements of human nature, force us to make a police force. I have no hesitating in answering. Law is common force organized to prevent injustice. There's a deeper wisdom before the Greeks. It was reincorporated into the founding, the philosophical founding, which valued very much the Greeks, the nation of the United States. The processes of corruption and degradation were described in 1815 by Bastiat and say this is inevitable, and everyone on the right and left is pushing in that direction and must be, even though every single person suffers and lives in a world of less goodness. If they could all just as a unit decide together to turn around, they could reset the state being involved in all these things. The proper role of the state is to stop rape and murder and theft, to stop Coca-Cola from getting a profit by poisoning a river or from kidnapping the grandchildren of the CEO of Pepsi. Okay? After you've done that, stay the fuck out of writing little careful laws that would slightly benefit if the lobbyists can craft it right. Coca-Cola's ability to find water and inconvenience Pepsi in order to make their beverages and all of that other fucking bullshit. Stop. Compete fairly, and both of you are richer. Spend billions of dollars lobbying the federal government to give you an unfair advantage because the other side is trying to get an unfair advantage, and the state becomes supreme and totalitarian and involved in everything, and everybody's poorer for it. You wouldn't choose to do that if the other side wasn't choosing to do it. We're all choosing to do it, and we're inevitably sliding towards socialism. We can choose to turn around. We're going to read tonight Aegis, who said to the corrupt society, remember the 500 years of awesomeness that we had with this great philosophical founding of ours? Notice how we've violated those principles and it's just steamrolled us into this thing and we all just keep feeling individually we have to keep going further even though none of us like it. Y'all don't like it, do you? This was a wealthy, successful individual in that society, went into politics, succeeded shockingly when no one expected, out of nowhere. And he just said, "Hey, everybody, what if we just shockingly decide we're all just going to go back?" And everybody said, "Fuck yeah." And they just did. So we're going to read about that tonight. It is not true that the legislator has absolute power over our persons and property since they pre-exist, and his work is only to secure them from injury. It is not true that the mission of the law is to regulate our consciences, our ideas, our wills. Oh, and by the way, the ancient Greek and Roman, the idea of Apollo, the mythology had this truth in it then too. It was just certain philosophers. All right, which again, we can have our arguments and stuff, but that's what he's taking aim at in any event. It is not true the mission of law is to regulate our consciences, our ideas, our will, our education, our sentiments, our works, our exchanges, our gifts, our enjoyments. Its mission is to prevent the rights of one from interfering with those of another. In any one of these instances, law, because it is force, because it has force for its necessary sanction, can only have the domain of force, which is justice. And justice, as he defined earlier, as the prevention of injustice, and nothing more positive than that. That's the limit of what justice means in the political sense, according to Bastiat. And as every individual has a right to have recourse to force only in cases of lawful defense, so collective force, which is only the union of individual forces, cannot be rationally used for any other end. All right, we may as well have to underline this because it's just been ghosted from the education of our people. But this used to be the lifeblood of education to understand this way of thinking. So, without arguing for or against it, let's underline what he means. What he's saying here in his natural law philosophy is that you are created by God and you have certain abilities, certain faculties, and you have certain aims. And all of that is not given to you by the state. Maybe you want to make a garden and grow some vegetables and make the world slightly better. Maybe you want to hunt a deer, whatever it is you want to do. It's just you naked in the woods. Okay, fine. Well, you have to sleep sometime. If somebody steals your bow and arrow, that's not good for you. You have a right to defend your stuff and to keep the product of your work, but it's hard for you to do that if everybody's at war with everybody else. So you come together with other people and you say, look, let's all each of us give up a little bit of our power. I voluntarily will submit to the laws. I won't rape. I won't murder. I won't kidnap. I won't defraud people in contracts. You do the same. You give up a little bit. I give up a little bit. We'll all come together and we'll collect those little bits of power and we'll create a state which has the monopoly on third party violence. They are the ones who will have only an interest in catching any of us who break this contract. If any of you violate those laws, they're going to put you in jail, and it'll make it so inconvenient for you to try to advance yourself that way that you will be free to be able to trust each other to stick with your contracts and to not do illegal things to gain stuff. That's it. That's where the state comes from. The state is not primary to the individual, according to the founding fathers, the natural philosophy. Again, we're not arguing for or against it. We're describing and understanding that this was the way that Bastiat was thinking. This was the way that the founders were thinking. The state derives its sovereignty from the consent of the governed. All governance, all law, all power is either usurped or granted. It's either stolen and imposed through tyranny or you vote for it. You say, I vote for this. I submit to whatever taxes this legislator decides to impose because I've voted and we came together consensually. All right. But the state is the product of people's trying to solve some problems. And the ancient mythology had it thus. The ancient mythology, I'm not saying the ancient philosophers, the ancient mythology had it right. Apollo, Genesis, the origin of cities is in opposition to fratricidal, to the worst elements of human nature. That's how it emerges. It is not the source of a final solution for things. And if you think it is, you're going to destroy everything in yourself first. You're going to destroy everything and everybody, and new fires will come into the world, as the text says. Okay. The law then is solely the organization of individual rights. that existed before the law. You had your sovereignty, you came and you organized this thing by giving up a little bit of it. Law is justice. So far from being able to oppress the people or to plunder their property, even now, again, I want to address something that we addressed more sharply, and he addressed more sharply in the first half, but he's been talking about things that would resonate with leftists for a bit here. I want to say something once again. Slaves are given food, clothing, housing, occasional medical care, and shit education. If your government is offering you those things, it's extending to you a chance to sell yourself into slavery. Slaves are made in such ways. That's what they also riot on the plantation sometimes and demand better, slightly better food. And sometimes they even get slightly better food, but with lots of punishment. That's how you make slaves. Free people cannot be looking to the government to give them any of those things. And Bastiat argues if you got the government out of it, we'd all have way more wealth. We'd all with if you stopped regulating businesses in the inner cities, I know plenty of suffering people who would be making their communities much better overnight. The only way they can do it is to pretend to do it by applying for a government grant for an extra special thing, which of course means by definition that the money economically wouldn't go into it that way to begin with. But there are plenty of people who would if they weren't being tortured by a slave state into not even being able to do that. We would be so much wealthier, every single person. And the power structure, which the individuals in the power structure of this totalitarian trending towards tyranny state that we have would also have more power. You can have 100% of the power of a steaming pile of garbage that's you've utterly destroyed, or you can have 30% of the power of something that has so much more power you cannot imagine. You cannot imagine the wealth that could be unlocked if we decided to do this, to just say, let's just reset and turn back around again, which has happened historically, and we will read about that. It must not be said either that it may be philanthropic so long as it abstains from all oppression, for this is a contradiction. The law cannot avoid acting upon our persons and property. If it does not secure them, then it violates them if it touches them at all. The law is justice. Nothing can be more clear and simple, more perfectly defined and bounded, or more visible to every eye, for justice is a given quantity, immutable and unchangeable, and which admits of neither increase nor or diminution. That's it. Why are you looking to these politicians to give you things? They don't have anything. If they had something to give, they would convince you to exchange purchasing power for their goods or services. They're not they're even worse than the corporations, which Bastiat has illustrated are causing all this damage through their association with the state. All of the stuff you hate about crony capitalism and subsidies for big corporations, he hates all that too. That's all the same thing, pushing in the same direction because everybody has to do it. When the government's powerful, you get in bed with it, you're in bed with something larger than yourself. The original religious people who founded secularism into this nation understood keep your state away from my church, wall of separation. And there are private religious schools and private schools in general today which refuse to take money from the federal government. They're offered it every year. Fuck off, they say. We don't want your money. We'll find a way to do this on our own. If you give us money, we know what that leads to. It leads to, well, next year we're reviewing the budget and we really didn't like some of the things that you were saying this year. And wouldn't it be good if you did that? Fuck off. Don't touch our project. You're going to poison it and destroy it. Would that academics grew a fucking pair of balls? Would that the academics cared about the value that's produced for the world out of their academic institutions as much as the religious in this country have valued and are less and less all the time, but there's still a remnant of it today, have valued a separation from cheap money and control from the state. We might actually have scientists and medicine that we could rely upon again. That's no fucking small thing, and the consequences are coming like Christmas. They're coming like Christmas. Nobody even respects experts who are brought on television, and they shouldn't. You've lost everything. You've given up everything. You sold your soul for obviously your inevitable destruction, which came as quickly as I said it would. Depart from this point. Make the law religious, fraternal, equalizing. industrial, literary, or artistic, and you will be lost in vagueness and uncertainty. You will be upon unknown ground in a forced utopia, or what is worse, in the midst of a multitude of contending utopias. Hello, welcome, each striving to gain possession of the law and to oppose it upon you. For fraternity and philanthropy, you have no fixed limits, as justice has. Where will you stop? Where is the law to stop? One person, Mr. Crick, will only extend his philanthropy to some of the industrial classes and will require the law to slight the customers in favor of the producers. Another, like Mr. Considerant, will take up the cause of the working class and claim for them by means of the law at a fixed rate clothing, lodging, food, and everything necessary to the support of life. A third, Mr. Blanc, will say, and with reason, that this would be an incomplete fraternity and that the law ought to provide them with tools of labor and education. A fourth will observe that such an arrangement still leaves room for inequality and that the law ought to introduce into the most remote hamlets luxury, literature, and the arts. This is the high road to communism. In other words, legislation will be as it now is, the battlefield for everybody's dreams and everybody's covetousness. Well, Jesus, in the 1850s, good job. Could we add a few paragraphs or sentences to this paragraph? I think we could. I think there's some people running for president of the United States who could fit into this model. One at least springs to mind. Law is justice. Well, one who springs to mind because she's literally advocating for the things that have already been proven to be failures. But where is it going to stop? It isn't going to stop. You're going to bankrupt everybody and starve everybody in an effort to create something out of nothing. All you have is force. That's all you have if you're looking to the state. They didn't do the work to create a good or service. They're just regulating other people's good work. Take them out of it as much as you possibly can and make them strong. Make sure that Coke doesn't make a profit by poisoning a river or kidnapping the grandchildren of Pepsi's CEO or something like that. Make sure everybody has to follow their contracts. Let them be strong. Let them oppose injustice from one individual against another within this system. Let them create the structure that makes the free market possible and then have a wall of separation from their interference because it will not stop. Every group will unionize. Every group will form a special interest. Every group will pour billions of dollars into fucking DC for the most shallow, hollow, ambitious losers to take bribes and come up with God knows what, or let somebody else. You're going to get screwed over. And if you're not going to get screwed over because you think you're really clever and you're going to get the reins of power, you're going to get screwed over in the next election. The system is the problem. It's being described. The problem with the system is being described in great detail in this essay, and it's comprehensible. And the founders of America understood it and set up a system in opposition to it. We will read the Constitution tomorrow. We will read the Declaration of Independence, but we will read the Constitution tomorrow. We'll read the eighth article. We will read the Interstate Commerce Clause. We will look at some of the legal history some of the details of what's going on here. In this proposition, we represent to ourselves a simple, immovable government. And I defy anyone to tell me whence the thought of a revolution, an insurrection, or a simple disturbance could arise against a public force confined to the repression of injustice. Under such a system, there would be more well being, and this well being would be more equally distributed. And as to the sufferings inseparable from humanity, no one would think of accusing the government of them. For if it would be as innocent of them as for it would be as innocent of them as it is of the variations of the temperature. Have the people ever been known to rise against the Court of Appeals or assail the justices of the peace for the sake of claiming the rate of wages, free credit, tools of labor, the advantages of the tariff, or the social workshop? They know perfectly well that these matters are beyond the jurisdiction of the justices of the peace, and they would soon learn that they are not within the jurisdiction of the law quite as much. I can think of another presidential candidate. Shall I fill in all the blanks? But if the law that one knows how to shake up the box though, and what we need is a great reset. So, but if the law were to be made upon the principle of fraternity, if it were to be proclaimed that from it proceed all benefits and all evils, that it is responsible for every individual grievance and for every social inequality, then you open the door to an endless succession of complaints, irritations, troubles, and revolutions. Law is justice, by which he means the opposition to injustice. And it would be very strange if it could properly be anything else. Is not justice right? Are not rights equal? With what show of right can the law interfere to subject me to the social plans of Messrs. Mimirel, de Melun, Thiers, or Blanc, rather than to subject these gentlemen to my plans? Is it to be supposed that nature has not bestowed upon me sufficient imagination to invent a utopia too? Is it for the law to make choice of one amongst so many fancies and to make use of the public force in its service? Law is justice, limited to that and that alone, to the opposition of injustice, of theft and rape and murder and breaking your contracts. And let it not be said, as it continually is, that the law in this sense would be atheistic, individual, and heartless, and that it would mold mankind in its own image. This is an absurd conclusion, quite unworthy of the governmental infatuation which sees mankind in the law, right? The founders were extremely religious. They invented secularism to protect their religions. They didn't think that religious people wouldn't have an effect on the government. That still happens, much to the chagrin of many of us, right? There's plenty of reasons to complain about that fact or to be grateful for it as well, both. But if there's no reason to say that you can't work towards the good apart from religion if you stop trying to get people with guns to make it happen. What then? Does it follow that if we were free, we shall cease to act? Does it follow that if we do not receive an impulse from the law, we shall receive no impulse at all? Does it follow that if the law confines itself to securing to us the free exercise of our faculties will be paralyzed? Does it follow that if the law does not impose upon us forms of religion, modes of association, methods of education, rules of labor, there's like no free men left in America, for fuck's sake, directions for exchange and plans for charity? We shall plunge headlong into atheism, isolation, ignorance, misery, and greed. Does it follow that we shall no longer recognize the power and goodness of God? That we shall cease to associate together, to help each other, to love and assist our unfortunate brethren, to study the secrets of nature and to aspire after perfection in our existence? Law is limited to punishing injustice. And it is under the law of justice, under the reign of right, under the influence of liberty, security, stability, and responsibility that every man will attain to the fullness of his worth, to all the dignity of his being, and that mankind will accomplish with order and with calmness. Slowly, it is true, but with certainty, the progress ordained for it. I believe that my theory is correct. For whatever be the question upon which I am arguing, whether it be religious, philosophical, political, or economical, whether it affects well being, morality, equality, justice, right, justice, progress, responsibility, property, labor, exchange, capital, wages, taxes, population, credit, or government, at whatever point of the scientific horizon I start from, I invariably come to the same thing. The solution of the social problem is in liberty. And have I not experienced on my side? Have I not experienced on my side? Cast your eye over the globe. Which are the happiest, the most moral, and the most peaceable nations? Those where the law interferes the least with private activity, where the government is the least felt, where individuality has the most scope, and public opinion the most influence, where the machinery of the administration is the least important and the least complicated, where taxation is lightest and least unequal, popular discontent the least excited and the least justifiable, where the responsibility of individuals and classes is the most active, and where, consequently, if morals are not in a perfect state, at any rate, they tend incessantly to correct themselves, where transactions, meetings, and associations are the least fettered, where labor, capital, and production suffer the least from artificial displacements, where mankind follows most completely its own natural course, where the thought of God prevails the most over the inventions of men. Those, in short, who realize the most nearly this idea that within the limits of right, it should flow from the free, perfectible, and voluntary action of man. Nothing be attempted by the law or by force except the administration of universal justice. I cannot avoid coming to this conclusion that there are too many great men in the world. There are too many legislators, organizers, institutors of society. I thought about calling this series Retarded Philosophy. There's just too many great men out there. There are too many legislators, organizers, institutors of society, conductors of the people, fathers of nations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Too many persons place themselves above mankind to rule and patronize it. Too many persons make a trade of looking after it. It will be answered, you yourself are occupied upon it all this time. It's very true. But it must be admitted that it is in another sense entirely that I am speaking. And if I join the reformers, it is solely for the purpose of inducing them to relax their hold. I'm not doing so. I'm not doing as Vaucanson did with his automaton, but as a physiologist does with the human frame. I would study and admire it. I am acting with regard to it in the spirit that animated a celebrated traveler. He found himself in the midst of a savage tribe. The enlightened one lives amongst men as amongst animals. He found himself in the midst of a savage tribe. A child had just been born, and a crowd of soothsayers, magicians, and quacks were all around it, armed with rings, hooks, and bandages. One said, "This child will never smell the perfume of a calumet unless I stretch its nostrils." Another said, "He will be without the sense of hearing unless I draw his ears down to his shoulders." A third said, "He will never see the light of the sun unless I give his eyes an oblique direction." A fourth said, "He will never be upright unless I bend his legs." A fifth said, "He will not be able to think unless I press his brain." "Stop," said the traveler. "Whatever God does is well done. Do not pretend to know more than he. And as he has given organs to this frail creature, allow those organs to develop themselves, to strengthen themselves by exercise, use, experience, and liberty. God has implanted in mankind also all that is necessary to enable it to accomplish its destinies. There is a providential social physiology as well as a providential human physiology. The social organs are constituted so as to enable them to develop harmoniously in the grand air of liberty. Away then with quacks and organizers, away with their rings and their chains and their hooks and their pincers, away with their artificial methods, away with their social laboratories, their governmental whims, their centralization, their tariffs, their universities, their state religions, their inflationary or monopolizing banks, their limitations, their restrictions, their moralizations, and their equalization by taxation. And now, after having vainly inflicted upon the social body so many systems, let them end where they ought to have begun. Reject all systems and try liberty. Liberty, which is an act of faith in God and in his work. Wrote an essay that we've entered the third chapter of the American project when Trump won in 2016. What you have now is the explicit in his first term, the explicit use of tariffs, the seizing of these reins to push them in a different direction than they were before. But it's still the same reins. Bastiat would say, it's still the same reins. We've now surrendered on the left and the right, the Democrat and the Republican options are between people who want to use the reins to benefit according to their scheme of how to benefit. but they're both still trying to use the reins. Now, that might be necessary since the reins have been used in the other direction. Fine. I vote for it. But Trump is quite a genius and a heck of a weird statesman and a weird individual in our history. And he does know how to shake up the box, and he knows how to call the Kennedys and say, "Hey, let's find the people aimed at good around here, and let's shake things up and find some solutions." Bastiat says the ultimate solution is to return to the principles that have been violated. You won't need any of these things. I mean, why do we need tariffs? To stop other countries from putting on tariffs, right? It's the Reciprocal Trade Act. It's not to generate money through the tariff. It's to say, stop all of this shit, right? It's to say, you've been selling our manufacturing overseas. You've been betraying the trust of the people, which is the only commodity that you had for decades now. Let's just reverse it and bring it back. So he's kind of using the reins to whip the rain whipper originally, perhaps. But the ultimate solution, if we want to make the most benefit out of this, once the damage has been undone, would be to return to the principles upon which our nation was founded. And the only way to do that is to read and study them and to study the ancient texts, the mythological milieu out of which these things emerged. And so we're going to continue doing those things. Tonight, we're going to read Aegis. Tomorrow I might be driving to a totally different state. Tomorrow, I don't know what we're doing. Tonight, we're going to read Aegis as promised, and no promises after that for now. We'll see y'all later.